This video is going to be a full HTML and CSS course for absolute beginners. Guys, I've literally spent hundreds of hours and thousands of my own dollars building out this very course that I'm looking at now. And I can guarantee you this is going to be the easiest and simplest HTML and CSS course that you ever watch in your life. And by the end of this course, I can promise you, you won't want to learn web development from anywhere else. So without further ado, let's stop wasting your time and jump straight into the course.
Before we dive straight in, let's talk about the tools you need to take this course. In this course, I'm going to use VS Code or Visual Studio Code, along with a few extensions for starting a local web server, formatting our code, and accessing coding shortcuts. You're welcome to use whatever code editor you want if you know what you're doing, but otherwise head over to code.visualstudio.com and download the latest version of VS Code. Now here inside of VS Code, we're going to install a couple of extensions. So let's open the extension panel and let's search for Prettier. Here's the extension that we want to install, Prettier Code Formatter. With this extension, we can format our code and make it look cleaner. And this is a very popular extension. As you can see, it's been downloaded more than 46 million times. So over here, you're going to have an install button, just click it and you'll be done. Next, we're going to install another extension called Live Server. With this extension, we can launch our website on a local development server to test things out. Again, this is a very popular extension. It's been downloaded more than 50 million times. Now, the final extension we're going to install is going to be Mithril Emmet. This extension is going to give us access to shortcuts when writing HTML code, which you will see throughout the course. Now, in addition to this, we're also going to use a web browser to test our web pages. Again, you can use whatever browser you want, but in this course, I'm going to use Google Chrome, and I encourage you to use the same browser so you can easily follow the course. Now that you have all the tools you need, let's jump straight into the crash course.
Hey, what's up? Welcome to the HTML crash course here at ASAP Frontend. Now, before we even dive into this crash course, I just want to say a huge congratulations to you for even being here watching this video. I know from first-hand experience how difficult it can be to take your first steps in this journey. Seeing a ton of videos that are super long can make you feel really intimidated, but you can rest easy because ASAP Frontend is going to take care of you. Follow everything that we tell you to do step by step and you will land a job in tech. Don't get demotivated. But enough with all that, let's jump straight into this crash course so we can get you coding as soon as possible. And we're gonna start this crash course by talking a little bit about what HTML actually is. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and that's something that you don't really have to remember. We're going to be calling it HTML 100% of the time anyways. But one thing you do need to understand is that HTML is not a programming language. Instead, it's a markup language that we use to build web pages. Now, if you're feeling a little bit confused right now, don't worry. Let's dive into an example so I can show you the difference between a programming language and a markup language. So right now we are on the ASAP Frontend website. And the actual difference between a programming language and a markup language is that a programming language allows you to set some sort of logic or rules. And one example of this on the ASAP Frontend website is you can see that we are currently logged in. And here we are using a programming language called JavaScript to say, hey, look, the user is logged in. So let's go ahead and show them this video. But the moment we log out of our account, JavaScript says, oh, the user is not logged in anymore. So let's go ahead and show them this pop-up instead. So again, you can see that programming languages set the rules and logic that control how our app works. If the user is logged in, show the video. If they are not, show this instead. But all of the stuff that we see on the page, so that's this image, this button, all of this text, it's all actually set using HTML. So if we go ahead and right click and and hit on inspect, all of this writing here is HTML that is determining how our page is going to look. So HTML is basically how we choose what content is going to be on our web page. And I want to quickly add on what actually makes this content look good. So that's the shapes, the colors, the text size, the font size, all of that stuff. That is set by something called CSS. So CSS is how we style our HTML and make it look a lot better. So just a quick recap of everything you just learned. HTML is how we actually set the content of our web page. CSS is how we style that content and make it look good. And then JavaScript is how we actually set the rules and logic that control how our app works. And you are going to be learning these three technologies throughout the program, as well as React and Firebase and a ton of other technologies. And that is going to allow you to build really powerful apps, just like ASAP Frontend. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves right now. Let's first jump into writing our first lines of HTML code. So let's start by heading to our desktop and creating a new folder called HTML Crash Course. And once that is created, we can open up Visual Studio Code and we can drag and drop this folder straight in. So now we have this folder opened up in our Visual Studio Code. What we can do is full screen into that. And what we are going to do in here is create a new file called index.html. So that way VS Code knows that this is a HTML file and that we are going to be writing HTML code. Now, the first thing we always do inside of these files is use the Mithril Emmet boilerplate. So we're going to type in exclamation mark and hit enter. And this is going to give us a really nice HTML boilerplate that we can work on top of. Now, what we are going to do next is right click on our HTML file and hit open with live server. And this is going to open a local development server where we can see and test our HTML code. So what we can do is put this on one side of our screen. So window and then left arrow, and then window and right arrow on our Visual Studio Code. And now we have these two side by side. And if we type something in here, say text, you can see that any changes that we make to this HTML file, we can immediately see inside of our live server. All right, now that we have all of the setup stuff out of the way, let's take a moment to break down all of this code that we have right here, because you're probably seeing a lot of intimidating code and you have no clue what it means. But don't worry, we're going to break it all down step by step right now. And in order to do that, I have to first teach you a little bit about what we call HTML tags. So everything in HTML is made up of tags, and different kinds of tags allow us to choose different kinds of content that we want to show on our page. So for example, at the bottom of this page here, you can see that we have a few different examples of HTML tags. We have button tags, we have paragraph tags, we have H1 tags, which are titles, and you can see that all of these tag names are surrounded in angle brackets. So for example, you can see here with our button tag that we have angle brackets on both sides. And for our paragraph tag, it's the same thing. We have angle brackets on both sides. And finally, for our H1 tag, you can see angle brackets on both sides. So that's definitely something you want to remember. All of our tag names are going to have angle brackets on both sides. Now, another thing you want to make a note of is these tags usually come in pairs. So we usually have a start and an end tag. So for example, let's take a look at our button here. It has a start tag and an end tag. And then we put any content that we want to be inside of this button between these two tags. And the same goes with our paragraph tag. We have a start tag and an end tag, and then we put all of the content that we want in between. And what you'll notice is the end tag looks exactly like the start tag, but just with a forward slash. So if we look at our button end tag, it looks the same as our button start tag, but just with a forward slash. And the same goes with our ending paragraph tag here and our ending H1 tag here. And one last thing you should know is some tags actually close themselves. So some tags don't actually need to have an end tag. But don't worry about that too much. That's something we're going to cover later on in this video. But for now, just focus on making notes on these key important points. And now enough with the boring theory. Let's dive straight back into our HTML so we can take a look at the different kinds of HTML tags. Alright, so now we're back in our HTML file and everything should be starting to make a little more sense to you now. We have some start tags here, some end tags here, but now let's take a moment to talk about what all of these different tags actually mean. So the first thing you need to know is that every single HTML document is going to have a very specific structure that looks something like this. So we're going to have the doc type HTML at the top, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's just saying that, look, this file is a HTML document. And then next we have the HTML tag, which is going to be wrapping all of the HTML that we write. And if we use the prettier extension that we installed by hitting Alt Shift and F, we can see that a little more clearly. Now the content inside of this HTML element is split up into two halves. We first have a head area and then we have a body area. Now what is inside of this head area actually has nothing to do with the content that we see on our page. So what we actually see. Instead, in here, we normally have some extra information about our website so that search engines like Google or Bing can get a better idea of what our website is actually about. And we also use this head area to link this HTML document to any CSS or JavaScript files that we might want to use. But now let's take a closer look at what is actually inside of our head area right now. So let's hit Control and plus to zoom in on this code. And the first thing we are seeing inside of our head area is this title element. And just to be clear, the difference between a HTML tag and a HTML element is that the tag refers to these individual things right here. So a start tag and an end tag. Now a HTML element refers to the start tag, the end tag, and any content in between. So these three combined make up one HTML element. So again, tags refer to these individual things right here, and an element is created when you have a start tag, an end tag, and you slap any content in between them. Now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about what this title element actually does. And all it does is set the title of our web page. So you can see we have document written inside of this title, and the web page title in our browser is document. And now if we go in and change this to HTML Crash Course, you'll see that the title on our webpage changes to HTML Crash Course. Now next we have these meta tags, and you're probably thinking, what the hell does all of this writing mean? But trust me, in order to become a successful front-end developer and land a job, you do not need to understand what these mean. So with that being said, that's pretty much everything you need to know about our head area. Now it's inside of this body that we are going to be doing all of the dirty work of writing the HTML that appears on our page. So let's remove this text that we have here, and let's actually start writing some HTML inside of our body. So let's create a H1. So type in H1, hit enter, and in between these two tags, we are going to type in hello world. And now you can see we actually see hello world on our page. So now let's add some more HTML. Let's head down here. Let's type in P. So we create a paragraph element, and in between the two tags, let's write I love ASAP front end. And now you can see in smaller text, we are getting I love ASAP front end. So you can see that all of the HTML that we write inside of our body is what is going to appear on our page. And a quick tip I want to show you is if you head to your browser and you hit F12, Chrome and most other browsers are going to give you some developer tools that are going to make your life so much easier when you're writing code and you run into some issues. And inside of these developer tools, there is a ton of tabs that you're going to be using once you get a little more advanced. But for now, we are going to stick to this elements tab right here. So we have our H1 and our paragraph. And what's also super cool is we can directly edit this code inside of our developer tools. So for example, we can click on this H1 and change it from hello world to hi world, and you can see here on our page it's actually being changed without actually changing our original HTML file. But if we hit refresh, it's actually going to go back to normal. So it's going to go back to using our HTML file. So this is going to be really good when you want to test something out, change some things in your code without actually directly changing your HTML file. Because if anything goes wrong or you mess something up, you can just reset the page and it'll go back to normal. So now let's close our developer tools and let's get rid of the elements that we have inside of our body currently. And now let's dive straight into the different elements that we can use inside of HTML. Now, before we get started, I have a quick tip for you, and that is to hit Control and slash, and that is going to allow you to write comments inside of your code. Now, this doesn't affect the content that we see on our page at all. It's just something that we write in here to make our code a little more readable and help us understand what's actually going on inside of our code. So for example, in here, we are going to type in headings because those are the first HTML tags that we are going to cover. And there's actually 6 heading tags that we can choose from. We have H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. So let's start off with a H1 and let's type in some text in here that says heading 1. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is that the text inside of our H1 is going to be a lot larger than any normal text that would write on our page. So if we head below here and write down some normal text, you'll again see that it's much larger. And the reason for that is our browser actually gives some default styles to our H1 element. That one makes our text much larger than normal, and 2, add some spacing around this H1 element. So now let's remove this text that we have here and let's take a look at the other headings that we can choose from. So the next one we have is heading 2. So in here, let's just type in heading 2. And then what we are going to do is duplicate this down. So Alt Shift and down arrow. And that's going to make a copy. And then we're going to do this a couple more times. So H3, H4, H5, and H6. And then we're going to change the text accordingly. So H3, H4, H5, and H6. And we'll also change the tag names. So this third one is going to be H3, this one H4, this one H5, and this one H6. And now you can see that our headings are just getting smaller and smaller as we go through them. And that is because the default styling, the default CSS given to these elements by the browser. And we can actually see these default styles at play if we open our developer tools. So let's hit F12, click on this option here. And if we hover over our headings, you'll see that the default font size is getting smaller and smaller. So at the top here, we have our H1, which starts off at 32 pixels. And then our H2 has a font size of 24 pixels. Our H3 has 18 pixels, H4, 16 pixels, and it continues to get smaller as we progress through our different headings. But these font sizes don't have to be stuck like this forever. We can actually change these using CSS, but that's something we're going to be getting into later on in the program. And with that, that's pretty much it for our headings. So let's close our developer tools and let's head down. And the next thing that we are going to be covering is paragraphs. So let's create a comment. So Control and slash, and we are going to be covering paragraphs. And in order to get a paragraph, we use the P tag. So let's type in P. And a quick tip I'm going to show you is whenever you want to have some sort of dummy text or placeholder text on your page, just type in lorem and then however many words of placeholder text you want. So for example, if you want 20 words of placeholder text, type in lorem 20. If you want 10 words, type in lorem 10, but we're just going to type in 20 for now, and then hit Alt Shift and F to let Prettier reformat our code. And you can see that our paragraph is now appearing on our page. And I'm going to quickly zoom out on my browser to 150. And if we hit F 12 to open our developer tools, we click on this option here and we hover over our paragraph, we can see that there's also some default styles given to this element by the browser. So it has a default font size of 16 pixels and some spacing on the top and bottom. And if we head back to ASAP Frontend, you'll notice that whenever we have some sort of big block of text on our page, that is when we use the P element. And now that's pretty much it for the paragraph element. But before we move on further, we have to quickly talk about the difference between inline versus block level elements. Now, block elements start on a new line and take up the full available width. But what does this actually mean? Well, if we head back to our code, we can see that all of the elements we currently have on our page are starting on a new line, and if we hover over them, we can also see they are taking up the full available width on the page. And that is because these are all block level elements. And I can actually prove this to you. If we select this H1 and we take a look at the default styles given to it by the browser, you can see that by default it has a display of block, and that means it is a block level element. So we know what block elements are now, but what are inline elements? Well, inline elements do not start on a new line and only take up the necessary width. Now let me show you what I mean by that. So if we head back to our code and I head below this paragraph and I create a B element, and all this does is make text bold. So let's type in something like hello, and you can see that the text is going to be bold by default. And now if I make multiple of these, so Alt, Shift, and down arrow to duplicate this a couple of times, you'll notice that they don't actually start on their own line. So if we take a look at all of the other elements on the page, you can see that they are taking up all of the width on the page, and each element is starting on their own line. But our B elements aren't actually doing that. They are only taking the necessary width to hold their text, and they are side by side. They are not starting on a new line. And this is how we know that they are inline level elements. Now there's a bunch of other inline level elements that you'll find out about as we continue through the crash course, but just quickly, another one is the I element. And all this does is make text italic. So if we type in hello in here, we get our italic text, and it's starting on the same line as the rest of these elements. Now we also have anchor elements. So if we type in A, and in here we type in hello, you can see that gives us a link, and it's starting on the same line as the rest of these elements. And we also have a span. Let's create that. And if we type in hello in here, it starts on the same line as the rest of these elements. So really important stuff here. Make sure you are taking these down as notes. So now let's head back to our code and clean up a little. So let's get rid of all of these extra B elements. And now you're probably pretty confused by this anchor element and this span element. So let's take a moment to talk about these two individually. So let's create a comment. So control and slash. This is going to be span. And then let's create one here. Control slash. This is going to be anchor elements. And now we'll start by talking about anchor elements. So in order to create an anchor element, what do? Well, we just type in A, and the Emmet extension that we installed gives us a nice little abbreviation where we get this anchor element, and we also get this href attribute. And essentially all attributes do is allow us to give a little more information about our elements. So in this case, this href attribute is allowing us to specify where we want to send the user when they click on this link, because that's what anchor elements are. They're just links. So let's say we want to go to google.com when we click on this link, and let's actually add some text between these two tags. And now you can see we get the option to click on this link, but if we do, it's actually not going to work. And the reason for that is we actually haven't added the HTTPS. So one crucial thing for you to remember is when you have your anchor element and you want to send someone to a website, when they click on it, you have to make sure to add the HTTPS to the front of it. And now if we click on our anchor element, it's going to send us to google.com with no issues at all. So again, if you want to go to a website, make sure you are adding the HTTPS. It's going to save you hours of headache. So now let's head back to our web page. And what you'll notice is when we click on this link, it's actually taking us away from our original web page. And a lot of the times, this is not actually what we want to do. So if we head back to ASAP Frontend and we open up this resources tab here and click on the community link, it's actually going to open up the link to the ASAP Frontend community in a new tab. So how do we actually make sure we are doing that in our web page? Well, how we'd normally do this is, and this is just going to be something that you have to remember, is we go to our anchor element, we give it a target attribute, and we give that a value of underscore blank. So target underscore blank. And now when we click on the link, it's going to open up the website in a new tab without closing the original web page. But you might not always want to use this target blank, especially when you're using this link to go to different HTML files, which is actually something you can do. So let's open up our sidebar so I can show you how to actually do that. So what we are going to do is create a new file, and let's call it about.html. So let's pretend this is some sort of different page on our website, you know, maybe an about us page. And now let's use Emmet abbreviation to give us this nice little boilerplate to work on top of. And what I always do is hit Alt Shift and F to make our code a little bit easier on the eyes. And inside of our body, I'm going to create a H1. And in here, let's just say about us page. And now what we can actually do is on this anchor element, we can set the href to about.html, and let's remove this target underscore blank. And now if we click on this link, you can now see that we are actually inside the about.html file. So all of the content that we are seeing right now is coming from the about.html document. And now if we go ahead and add an anchor element inside of our about page and say that we want this to send us to our index.html, and in here, let's say back to index.html. And if we click on this link now, it's going to send us back to our index.html file. So now what we're going to do is close this file. And what we are going to do is jump into a little bit of a challenge to make sure you understood everything you just learned. Because at ASAP Frontend, we don't just want you sitting down and watching me write code. We want you to dive in and get your hands dirty in writing some actual code. So your first challenge is going to be to create a link that sends us to asapfrontend.com. And one key note is it must open on a new tab. So again, the first challenge is to create a link that sends us to asapfrontend.com, and it must open on a new tab. And your second challenge is to create a link that opens up a new file called contact.html. So create a new file called contact.html. I want you to render out some content in there, and then inside of our index.html, create a link that is going to send us to that file. So I'll give you a couple of seconds now to pause the video and give this a shot, and we will walk through the solution together once you are done. All right, welcome back. Hopefully you managed to find a solution to this problem. Now let's actually walk through how we would go about solving this problem. So what's our first assignment? It's to create a link that sends us to asapfrontend.com, and it must open on a new tab. So the first thing we have to do is create an anchor element. And what website are we going to? Well, we're going to asapfrontend.com. So https asapfrontend.com. html.com. Because remember guys, if we're going to some sort of external link, some sort of external website, we need to have the HTTPS or it's not going to work. And now let's quickly type in some text inside of this anchor element. And now if we click on this link, we should be going to asapfrontend.com. And it looks like we are, but it's not opening up in a new tab like it's supposed to. It's taking us away from our original web page. So in order to make sure that that is not happening and we are opening up a new tab when we click on this link, we have to create a target attribute and we are going to give it a value of _ blank. And now if we click on this link, it's going to open up a new tab and send us to asapfrontend.com. So that is our first assignment complete. So now let's move on to our second assignment, which is to create a link that opens up a new file called contact.html. So the first step in this process is to actually create our contact.html file. So let's open up our sidebar and create a new file called contact.html. And here, let's use our Emmet boilerplate and then Alt, Shift, and F. And in here, let's create a H1. And this is going to say contact page, just so we know that we're actually in the contact page. And now we can close out this sidebar and head back to our index.html. Let's create a new anchor element. And we want this link that we just created to open up our contact.html file. So what's the href of this link going to be? It's going to be contact.html. And this time we don't have to add on the target blank since we aren't opening this up in a new tab, and we can just type in contact page in here. And if we head back to our page and click on this link, it'll take us to our contact.html file. And we know it's our contact.html file because we can see our H1 here. So that's it for our challenges. What we are going to do now is clean up our code just a little bit. Let's add a little bit of space here. And what we are going to do is get rid of this span. And we're going to create a comment. And in here, we are going to write lists because that is the next HTML topic that we are going to cover. So let's head back to index.html so that we can dive straight into lists. Now in HTML, there is actually two kinds of lists. There's ordered lists and unordered lists. And we are going to start by covering ordered lists because that is the one that you are going to be using most often. We'll still cover ordered lists, but we'll do that after. So in order to create an unordered list, you just type in UL, so UL, and typically inside of a list, you have different list items, right? You have different bullet points. So in order to create those different dot points, those different list items, we use the LI element, which stands for list item. And again, these are going to be the different list items, the different dot points within our list. So now we've created 3 list items, and in here, we can say text 1. In the second one, we can say text 2. And in the third one, we can say text 3. And now what we can do is use prettier, so Alt, Shift, and F to reformat our code and make it look a lot more readable. And now if we head back to our page, you can actually see we are getting a list with different dot points. And we can also see that a list item is actually a block level element. So if we click on this option here and hover over our unordered list, you can see that it's starting on a new line and taking up the full available width on the page. Now, these list items don't always have to have bullet points. Using CSS, we can actually customize this and make them have different kinds of points and actually make them have no points at all. It all really depends on what you want, but again, we're going to be covering CSS later on in the program. Now, typically, we use unordered lists when the order of our lists doesn't really matter. And let me visualize this to you by creating a quick grocery list with you. So let's head above this unordered list and let's create a H1 that says grocery list. So let's say we are at the grocery store and we want to get some apples, some bananas, and some grapes. Now, the order that we put these fruits in doesn't really matter. We could start by getting the bananas and then move on to the grapes and then finish off with the apples. Or we could start off getting the grapes and then move on to bananas and then get the apples. Again, it doesn't really matter. And that is where we would be using an unordered list. And this is going to be the case 99% of the time. But if the order of your list really does matter and you want to have that structure, that is when you would be using an ordered list. So to create an ordered list, we use the OL tag instead of the UL tag. And the structure of ordered list and unordered list are exactly the same. We have different list items in here for all of the different list items, the different bullet points. But now let's say this list is a little bit different. It's not a grocery list. It's now a leaderboard. And let's say in first place, we have Usain Bolt. In second place, we have Ronaldo. And third place, we have Messi. And now if we head back to our page, you can see that our ordered list actually gives us some numbers to order our list by. So this is just something that is good to remember. If the order of your list doesn't matter, then you want to use an unordered list. And that is going to be the case 99% of the time. But if the order of your list does matter, then use an ordered list and you will get numbers to order your list by. And now that's pretty much everything you need to know about lists. Now the next thing we are going to cover is forms. And how we are going to create a form element is we just type in form and we can use the Emmet abbreviation to get our form element. And you can see that we actually get an action attribute by default. And how this action attribute works is when the user fills in all the details of this form and submits it, it's inside of this action attribute that we specify what we actually want to do once the user has submitted the form. And let me give you a quick example. If we open up ASAP Frontend and we hit on login, you'll see that all of this information that you can fill in is surrounded by a form. So we put all of the information that we want the user to fill in inside of a form. And once the user fills in all of the information, would go ahead and log the user in using a programming language like JavaScript. So would say that the action that we want to perform after the user submits this form is logging the user in using JavaScript. But since we don't know any programming languages right now, we can go ahead and remove this action attribute for now. And now we can head back to our HTML document and let's actually talk about the kind of elements we would be putting inside of a HTML form. Now, the first element would put inside of a form is a label element, and we can remove this for attribute. It's not really too important. And inside of this element, let's type in first name, and below it, let's create an input element. Now, immediately you are going to notice two really weird things about our input element. First, why doesn't it have an end tag? And second, why does it have a type? Well, this is actually our first example of a self-closing tag. So this input element doesn't actually need a closing tag. And now a quick best practice that I want to show you is whenever you have a self-closing tag like this, you want to go to the end and add a /. And this helps us keep our code more consistent and clear. And this just gives us a way to know that this is not a start tag that we forgot to close. It makes it very clear that, okay, this is a self-closing tag. Now, why this input has a type attribute is because there is actually multiple different kinds of inputs that we can use. So with that being said, let's go ahead and select all of this and Alt, Shift, and down arrow to duplicate it down so we can talk about the different input types, starting with the email input. So let's change the label to say email. And in order to turn this text input into an email input, all we need to do is change this type from text to email. And now if we head back to our page and I zoom out, we can see that we have our text input and our email input side by side. And that is because all of these elements are inline level elements, meaning they are not going to start on a new line. But let's say we wanted to have our first name label and first name input on one line, and then have our email label and email input on another line, just like we have here on ASAP frontend. How do we actually tell HTML that that is how we want to lay out our page? Well, in order to do that, we have to use the div element. And what I'm going to do is put our first name label and input inside of one div, and then put our email label and input in another. And now if we head back to our page, you can see that we have our first name label and input on one line together, and then we have our email label and input on another line together. And that is really the whole purpose of divs. If we hover over it, you can see that VS Code tells us that a div element has no special meaning at all. It's not like it's specifically a title, a paragraph, or anything like that. What div actually stands for is division. So we use div elements to sort of separate and divide the pieces of content on our page into different little sections. So in this example, you can see that we put all of the stuff to do with our first name, so our label and our input, inside of one div. And then we put all of the stuff to do with our email in another div. And this sort of just helps to keep everything separated and easy to understand. So we can look at this and say, okay, all of the stuff to do with the first name we put inside of here, and all of the stuff to do with the email we put inside of here. And that just makes our code easier to read, rather than having all of our inputs and labels jumbled together in one form. And a nice little side effect that we get when we use divs is that they are actually a block level element by default. And this makes div elements come in very handy for when we want to sort of section out and work with inline elements on our page. But with that being said, let's head back to covering our inputs. Now, the reason we use an input with a type of email rather than a type of text, because an email is literally just text, right? So why don't we just use the input with a type of text? Is because the email input gives us some extra validation to make sure what we are typing in here is actually an email. And let me show you what I mean by this by heading to the ASAP frontend website. If I fill out this password and I enter an invalid email into this email input, we're going to get a rect squiggly line, and you can see we're also getting an error saying please include an @ in the email address. What we have written in is missing an @. So it's saying, look, your email address is not valid. Give us a valid email address. So again, all the type of email does is give us a little bit of extra validation that makes our life easier in the long run. So now let's head back to our HTML document and look at a few more input types. So let's duplicate this down. So let's select this, Alt Shift and down arrow. And the next type of input we are going to be looking at is the password input. So let's change the type to password and the label to password. And now if we head back to our page and we type something inside of this input, you can see that it's actually going to be hidden, just like a regular password. So now let's duplicate this down again. So Alt Shift and down arrow to take a look at our next kind of input. And that is going to be the number input. So let's change the label to number and the type to number. Now, using the number input is pretty self-explanatory. We have the option to increase the number inside of this input as well as decrease it. And we can also come in here and type in a custom number. But of course, we can't type in any text values. It will not let you. Now let's duplicate this down one more time to look at our last input. And that is going to be the date input. And this one is also pretty self-explanatory. We get this nice UI that allows us to select and choose from a range of dates. And of course, we can also come in here and custom change these values. Now what we're going to be doing next is going through a couple of elements that behave a lot like inputs, but don't actually use the input tag. And I know that sounds pretty confusing, but once I explain it to you, it's all going to make sense. So what we're going to do is duplicate this div down. And now let's say we wanted to create a message input. So one of those big message inputs where people can write you, say, an email. Now, in order to do that, we are not going to be using the input element. What we actually have to do is use the text area element, and we can get rid of all of this weird stuff here. And the first difference you'll notice between the text area and the input is this is actually not a self-closing tag, and we also don't have to add the type attribute. And what you'll notice is if we head back to our page, while these inputs are way too small to write any sort of message in, we can actually change the size of our text area however we please so that we are able to write long-winded email messages inside of this text area. So now let's refresh our page to get our text area back to normal. And now the last input that we are going to be covering is a select element. So let's change this label to select. And in order to get our select element, we're going to remove this text area and then create our select element. And where we typically use a select element on our page is when the user can choose between a couple of different options. So for example, let's say we were having the user choose the size of their clothing on our website. So if the user is choosing the size of their clothes, they have to have options to choose from, right? So what we'd do is for each option that the user can choose, we add an option element inside of our select element. So let me give you some examples. So let's create an option element, and let's say that the first option the user can choose is extra small. So we type in XS, and then let's Alt Shift down arrow to duplicate this down a couple of times and create a couple more options. The second option is going to be S, so small. The third option is going to be medium. The fourth option is going to be large. And now if we head back to our page, we can actually choose between these four options. Now, one thing you always want to remember is you want to fill in the value attributes of these options. So our first one gets a value of extra small. Our second one gets a value of small. Third one, medium. And our last one, large. And the reason we do this is when the user submits the form and we want to work with the option that the user chose inside of a programming language like JavaScript, this just makes our life doing that a lot easier. So now what I want to talk about next is how we can actually submit a form. So if we head to ASAP Frontend, you'll notice that at the bottom of our form, we have this button, and when we hit this button, our form is submitted and we go ahead and log the user in. So in order to submit our form, all we need to do is add a button to the bottom of our form, and we can have some text that says submit inside of this button. And now if we head back to our page and click this submit button, nothing is actually going to happen. And that is because we don't actually have a programming language like JavaScript to perform some sort of action when the form is submitted. And with that, that's pretty much everything you need to know about HTML forms. But before we move on to our next topic, there is just one last thing that I want to show you. So if we head back to the login form at ASAP Frontend, what you'll notice is that our inputs actually have this sort of gray placeholder text. And whenever we type in some text, it actually disappears. And this honestly looks really good. But the question is, how do we actually get this on our inputs? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Let's scroll up to our first input. So let's say our text input. And all we have to do to get that placeholder text is use the placeholder attribute. And we can type in whatever we want in here, but in this case, let's just say type in your first name. And now if we head back to our page, you can see that we are getting that cool placeholder text. But if we type something in here, it disappears. But again, when the input is empty, the placeholder comes back. So that's just something cool that I wanted to show you. But with that, we are officially finished with forms. So let's head below our form and create a new comment. So control and /. And in here, we are going to type in images because that is the next topic that we are going to cover. In order to use images in HTML, we use the img tag. And what you'll notice is just like an input element, this is a self-closing tag. And what did we do for the input element, which was a self-closing tag? We added a / to the end of it just to keep our code consistent and easier to read. Now, by default, we get two attributes with our image elements. The first one being the src attribute. And this is actually how we tell HTML where to look for our image. And there's actually two ways we can do this. First, we can tell HTML to look externally, so on the internet for our image, or we can tell HTML to search locally within our computer, within our machine for that image. And we are going to start by covering that first method. So let's head back to ASAP frontend, and we're going to right click on this logo and hit copy image address. And then what we'll do is paste that into this src attribute. And now if we head back to our page, you can see we're getting the ASAP frontend logo as our image. Now let's say we wanted another image from the internet. Let's say we wanted an image of Superman. Well, what we could do is go to Google, search for Superman, click on images, and we can right click and copy image address on any of these images and just paste it directly into this src attribute. And now if we head back to our page, we have Superman appearing as our image. And that is how we get an image from the internet externally. But the question is, how do we get an image that is stored locally on our device? Well, let me teach you how to do this by first installing this image. So let's save image as, and then let's go to our desktop and then go within the HTML Crash Course folder. And here, let's save this image under the file name Superman. And now if we open up our sidebar, we should be seeing superman.jpg inside of our HTML Crash Course folder. Now what we need to do in order to get this image displaying on our page is we have to remove all of this stuff here. And we can simply just say that we want to use the Superman .jpg image. And now if we take a look at our live server, you can see that we have the same Superman image appearing on our page. And the reason we can just write superman.jpg inside of the src attribute and it works is because our Superman image and our index.html file are in the exact same folder on the exact same level. So they're literally in the exact same folder and they are side by side. And because of that, we don't have to do anything extra. We can just type in superman.jpg and it works. But let's say we had this image inside of an images or assets folder. So let's drag and drop this in. Well, what you'll notice is since our image and our index.html file are no longer on the same level, this is not actually going to work anymore. And the reason for that is that HTML by default starts by searching for files on the same level as the current HTML file. So this is what HTML sees right now, and it's searching for a superman.jpg image that's on the same level as this HTML file. So it's looking for this superman.jpg file, but it's not going to find it. It's only going to see this assets folder. It's not going to see any deeper. So what we need to do is specify that we want to go inside of the assets folder, and inside of that, we want to grab superman.jpg. So in the image src, we have to specify that we're first going inside of the assets folder, and then inside of the assets folder, we want to grab the superman.jpg image. And now if we head back to our page, we can now see our image is appearing properly. But let's say we had another folder inside of this assets folder called images. And let's say only in there did we have our Superman image. And on a side note, you can see that VS Code is doing this weird thing that is making it difficult to tell what is going on. So in order to fix that, what we are quickly going to do is click on this top option here, head to File, Preferences and Settings. And in here, we are going to search for compact folders. and make sure that is unchecked. And that is going to set this back to normal and make this easier to understand. So now back to the question at hand. How do we tell HTML that we want to go inside of our assets folder, and then inside of our images folder, and then inside of that, we want to grab our Superman image? Well, I'm actually going to give you a couple of seconds to figure that out for yourself. Try and figure out how to tell HTML that we want to go inside of our assets folder and our images folder and grab our superman.jpg image. I'll give you a couple of seconds to give that a shot, and once you are done, we can walk through the solution together. Hey, welcome back. Hopefully you managed to find a solution to this problem. So now let's actually take a moment to think about how we can solve this problem. So let's start off by closing our images and our assets folder and searching for our image like HTML would. Well, how would HTML look for our image? Well, it would start by looking through files and folders that are on the same level as index.html. So it's looking through, it's trying to find the assets folder, and bang, it's found its match. So we've found the assets folder. What are we going to do next? Well, we are going to go inside and look for superman.jpg. So we go within the assets folder and look for superman.jpg, but this is what HTML sees. All it sees is this images folder. It doesn't see superman.jpg. So what do we have to do? Well, we have to specify that we want to go inside of the assets folder, inside of the images folder, and only then can we look for superman.jpg. So we have to say we want to go within the assets folder, and then go within the images folder, and then grab superman.jpg. And now you can see our image is appearing on our page. So I hope the solution made sense. And those are the two ways we can search for images using the src attribute. We can search for the image locally within our computer, or we can search for the image externally on the internet by copying the image address and just pasting it straight into the src attribute. Now there's one last thing that we have to cover about images, and that is this alt attribute right here. It's not super important, but it's just here for accessibility purposes. So let's say someone is blind and they are using what we call a screen reader. So that's just something that sort of goes through your website and describes the content to the blind person. This alt attribute is where we tell the screen reader what our image is actually about, so that it can correctly describe it to the blind person. So in the alt attribute, would just say something like, this is a Superman image, and this is what the screen reader would read out to the blind person. And now that's pretty much it for images. Now we're going to be moving on to our next topic. So let's create a comment using control and /. And the next topic that we are going to cover is going to be buttons. So buttons are pretty simple. All we have to do to create a button is use the button tag. And between these two tags, we can of course write in whatever we want to see inside of our button. So in this example, I wrote click me. And now you can see we have a button that says click me. And what we can actually see here is that images and buttons are actually inline level elements. So they are actually going to be side by side, and they aren't going to start on a new line. And I actually don't like that. I'd like this button to be on its own line. So what I'm going to do is create a div, and then I'm going to place this button inside of this div. And since a div is a block level element, it's going to start this button on a new line. And this is another example of where divs come in really handy in helping us sort of organize and lay out the content on our page. And with that, that is pretty much it for buttons. Now the last thing we are going to be covering is spans. So let's create a new comment, control and /. And in here, let's type in spans. Now, the reason we'd use a span element is, let's say we had a paragraph, and let's say this paragraph said land a job with ASAP frontend. And like I mentioned earlier on in the video, we can actually bold certain text by using the B tag. So if we put ASAP frontend inside of the B element, if we scroll down, we can actually see land a job with ASAP frontend in bold. But let's say instead of setting ASAP frontend to bold, let's say we wanted to change the color. Well, what we would do is instead of wrapping ASAP frontend in the B tags, we would wrap them in a span. And what we would do is we would give this what we call a class name, and using CSS, we would go in and target this individual span. And again, in CSS, we would give it, say, a color of red. And don't worry, I know you don't know how to do any of this stuff yet, but I just wanted to quickly show you this to give you an idea of why we would actually use spans. And with that, I want to say a huge congratulations to you because we have actually completed the HTML crash course. And what we've actually done throughout this entire video is created a HTML cheat sheet that you can refer back to whenever you get stuck. So let's say you're trying to create some headings. What you can do is come back to this cheat sheet and look at all of the different headings that you can use. Or maybe you get stuck when you are creating a form. You can come down here and see all of the different types of inputs that you can use. Or maybe you're struggling with images. Well, you can come down here and see all of the different ways that we can set our images. And I've got some good news for you. This is pretty much all of the HTML that you need to know in order to land a 6-figure front-end developer job. Now, if you are still feeling confused and feel like you don't understand anything, don't worry, you are not meant to. This crash course is just meant to give you a basic idea of how everything works. So even if you kinda understand what's going on, you are doing really well. And if we head to ASAP frontend, you can see just how many projects we are going to do to drill these fundamentals into you. So again, don't worry if you aren't understanding things right now, that is going to come with time. Give yourself a huge pat on the back for getting through this crash course, and I will see you in the next one.
Yo, what's up guys? Welcome to the CSS Crash Course here at ASAP Frontend. CSS is a super important part of becoming a front-end developer, and if you don't learn CSS right, you're going to be confused for the rest of your career. But lucky for you, you're learning from ASAP Frontend, and we're going to make sure that doesn't happen by walking you through the best CSS crash course of all time. Now let's stop wasting your time and jump straight into it. Now before we begin, I just want to make it clear that this crash course is going to require you to know basic HTML. So if you've gone through the HTML crash course here at ASAP Frontend, or you've already played around with HTML before, you should be good to go. So now that that's out the way, let's jump straight into this and begin by talking a little bit about what CSS actually is. Well, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and don't worry about remembering this name, we're going to be calling it CSS 100% of the time anyways. But what's really important to remember about CSS is that it's not a programming language, it's a styling language used to style websites. So if we head to Google, we already know it's HTML that's setting the content of the page. So this image is HTML, this search input is HTML, and these buttons are HTML. But what's actually setting the size of this image? What's making this search input rounded? What's giving these buttons their color and giving them this hover effect? Well, that's all CSS. And if we inspect element and click on this little square here, we can actually hover over any element on the page. And if we click on it, we can see all of this CSS that's getting applied to it to give it its look. This right here is all CSS. And it may look like gibberish to you right now, but even if you don't know CSS, you can make out a little bit of what's going on. So for this button, we can see that CSS is setting its background color to this gray color. We're also giving it a border, we're giving it color, we're giving it its font family, we're setting the font size, we're changing the height, we're changing the width. So HTML allows us to put elements on our page, and CSS allows us to take those elements and make them look good. And just with those two, you'll be able to build beautiful things. By the time you get through the HTML and CSS section here at ASAP Frontend, you're going to be able to build this entire website on your own with just HTML and CSS. And you're going to learn how to do that by building beautiful websites like these alongside me. And that's not all. You can see that these websites are going to be completely responsive, meaning that they look good on mobile, desktop, and everything in between. So you're also going to be learning how to do that, how to make your websites look good on every single device. So we've got some super fun stuff coming up ahead, but let's focus on what's in front of us right now, which is learning the basics of CSS. So let's start off by creating a new folder. I'm going to call this CSS Crash Course. You can call this whatever you want. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a HTML file. Once we create our HTML file, let's go ahead and use this Emmet abbreviation to give us this nice boilerplate to start off with. And let's quickly type something in here. So let's say hello world, and let's right click on our HTML file and click open with a live server. And this is going to open up a nice little page where we can test our code, and you can see hello world here and hello world on our page, which means everything is working fine. Now that everything is all set up, let's talk about the few ways that we can actually start using CSS on our HTML elements. There's 3 methods we can use to actually start using CSS in our code. The first is inline CSS, which means adding styles directly into the HTML element. So what this would look like is, let's say we had a h1 element, and in here let's just type in hello world. To use CSS to style this element, what we could do is use the style attribute. And within this, we can type in all the CSS that we want. So let's say we want the color to be equal to red. And you can see that the styles are being applied directly to the HTML element. And that's all inline CSS is. Just going to the element, adding a style attribute, and then giving it the styles that you want. So that's one for your notes. Inline CSS adds styles directly to the HTML element. Now the next method is internal CSS. And this involves using style tags within a HTML document to add your styles. Let me show you what that looks like. So to use internal CSS, what do? We go within the head element, we open up a style tag, and within here we write all the CSS code that we're going to use to style our elements. So let's remove this inline CSS, and let's figure out how to use internal CSS to style this h1 element. So what we're going to do is we're going to target our h1 element. So this is going to say, hey, we want to add styles to our h1. And after that, we have to add brackets. And within these brackets, we can actually add the CSS properties that we want to affect this h1. So let's add a CSS property now. For example, the color property. So color, colon, and then we have to specify the value that we want to give to this h1 element. So we want it to have a color of red, and we have to end it with this semicolon. Adding this semicolon to the end of your CSS properties is very important, because if we remove this and we try to add another property, let's say font size 24 pixels, you can see what's it going to say? It's going to say semicolon expected. So at the end of each CSS property, don't forget to add the semicolon so that we can use multiple CSS properties. And that's all internal CSS is, using the style tags within the HTML file and then adding the styles that we want within there. Now the last method for adding CSS is external CSS, and this is the recommended method. This is the best practice method, and you want to be avoiding internal and inline CSS as much as you can, and always be using external CSS. Of course, there may be some times where you have to use inline CSS or internal CSS, but as a general rule, always try to use external CSS wherever you can. This is a best practice used at most companies. And how do we actually use external CSS? Well, it involves creating a new external CSS file and linking it to the HTML document. Let me show you what that looks like. So let's remove this. And in order to use external CSS, what did we say? We have to create a new external CSS file. So what are we going to do? We're going to create a new file. And well, let's call this styles.css. And in here, let's do the exact same thing we did before. Target the h1 element, squiggly brackets, and within here, we can actually add our CSS properties. So color, colon, And this is going to allow us to actually target the color property. And what value do we want it to have? Well, we want it to have a color of red. So we're going to type in red, and we're going to add the semicolon at the end. Because what happens if we don't add the semicolon? When we try to add another property, it's not going to let us, and it's going to say semicolon expected. So we have to add that semicolon so that we can add multiple CSS properties. So we've targeted the font size property now, and what font size do we want to have? Well, we want to have a font size of 24 pixels. And you can see now that even though we've targeted our H1 element and we've given it CSS properties, they're not showing up on our page. And that's because we've missed a step. We've created our external CSS file, yes, but we forgot to actually link it to our HTML document so that the HTML can actually use the styles from that file. So currently our CSS file is not linked. So in order to do that, we have to head to our HTML file. Within the head element, have to create this link tag. And you can see that we have this rel attribute here that's saying style sheet. And this is essentially just saying that the relationship between the linked file and the HTML document is a CSS style sheet. We also have this href attribute, which we know from the HTML Crash Course is used to specify the URL, the link, or the file name. So what's the name of our CSS style sheet? Well, it's styles.css. And you can see that once we link our external CSS file to our HTML document, our element is actually able to use the styles, and that's when we can see them on our page. And that's how we use external CSS. That's how we use the best practice method. And the reason for that is if we create an app and it starts to scale and get bigger, having our CSS and our HTML all in one file is going to make the file extremely big and hard to navigate through. So having our HTML and our CSS separate makes it much easier to navigate through our app, makes it much more maintainable, and makes it much easier to work in a team, especially when our app starts to scale. So now that we know the 3 methods for adding CSS, let's actually walk through the most common CSS properties. A lot of beginners make the mistake of trying to learn and memorize every single little CSS property. This is a huge mistake because you're meant to learn CSS on the go. So as we work our way through the course and you start to build more projects, over time you just start to build an understanding of how to use all the CSS properties. So again, trying to memorize and learn every single little CSS property is a huge mistake and a bad way of learning. Just focus on learning the most common CSS properties like the ones on the screen right now, and you can learn the rest by building projects. So right now we are going to be walking through these common CSS properties one by one, and before we do that, I'm going to give you a brief overview of what each of these do. So we'll start off at the top, and background color is going to set the background color of your element. Color is going to set the actual color of your text. Width and height allows you to control the width and height of your element. Font family allows you to control what font your text is going to be. Font size allows you to control how big or small your text is going to be. And font weight allows you to control whether your font is going to be bold, normal, or light. And border is going to allow you to put a border around your element. We're going to start off by covering in detail these colors properties. So background color is used to set the background color of your element, and color is used to set the color of the text. That's one for your notes. So once you've got that down, let's jump into a live code example. So we're back in our code, and let's get rid of this font size for now. And you can see that we've already set the color of our H1 element. Now let's actually try and set the background color of our element. So if we go down and add another property, so this background color property here, and let's give it a background color of black, you can see that our H1 is going to have a background color of black. And you can see here that these 2 properties are pretty self-explanatory. The color, we've set it to red. So what happens? Our text has a color of red. we've set the background color to black. So what happens? The background color is black. But this isn't the only way to set colors. So right now we're using words to specify color, right? And that's one way to add colors. So if we type in, say, another color, just M, and you can see already that CSS has a bunch of different color names that we can use to add color, to specify what color we want. So let's pick one of these values here, medium aquamarine, and you can see that our text is now getting this blue color. But let's remove this. And if we type something in again, you can see that next to the actual name of the color, we get this weird sort of code. This is what we call a hex code. And what we can actually do is, instead of writing the name of the color, we can actually type in its hex code and we will still get the same color. So instead of writing light cyan, let's type in E0FF. And you can see that we're actually getting a light cyan color just by writing this hex code. And it works the same here. If we get rid of this and we type in hashtag 000,000, you'll see that we still get the background color of black, because that is black's hex code. And if we inspect element, you can see that all the different colors across the spectrum have their own unique hex code that we can use to specify that's the color we want to use. But would you believe me if I told you that there was even another way that we can set color? If we change this back to red, and let's hover over this, you can see that we're using the RGB value here. And if we take this and type this in here, so RGB 255, 0, and 0, and can't forget to add the semicolon, what are we going to get? We're going to get the exact same red color. So that's another way that we can set color. So if we take this RGB and we want to use it to set a background color of black, we can just type in RGB 0, 0, 0, and what do we get? We get this black color. What we can also do with RGB is we can set an alpha. So if we add an A here, we can actually add another value that allows us to control how transparent our background color is. And the scale for this alpha value here goes from 0 to 1. 0 meaning it's going to be fully transparent, 1 meaning it's going to be not transparent at all, and then everything in between allows us to set how transparent we want our background color to be. So those are the 3 ways to set color. This is definitely one for your notes. We can use color names, so red, yellow, orange, blue. We can use hex code, so hashtag 0000FF would return blue. And we can also use RGB, so RGB 00255 would return blue as well. And we can optionally add a alpha value here to allow us to set the transparency of our color. So now that we have that out the way, let's jump into our next properties, which are going to be these size properties here. So the width property is used to set the width of the element, and the height property is used to set the height of the element. So as always, let's jump into a live code example to show you how these are actually used. What I'm going to do is head back to my HTML file, going to get rid of this H1. I'm going to create a div. And from there, what I'm going to do is target this div in our CSS. So target the div, quick brackets so that we can actually add the CSS properties inside of here. And what I'm going to do is give this a width of 300 pixels. So what this is going to do is give this div element here that we targeted a width of 300 pixels. And I'm also going to give it a height of 300 pixels. And just so that we can see it, I'm going to set the background color to red. And you can see here that these 2 properties are pretty self-explanatory. They just allow us to set the width and the height of our element. So if we change the width to, say, 400 pixels, a larger value, what's going to happen? The width of our div is going to increase. And the same With the height, if we set it to a higher value, what's going to happen? The height of our div is going to increase. Now, setting the width and height of our elements to pixel values like this is called hard coding values, and we don't like to do this. Because what this means is the width and height of the element is going to stay at 400 pixels no matter how big or small the screen is. It's not dynamic, and if we hit inspect element, you'll see that when the screen size starts to get really small, the width and the height of the elements are not changing, they're overflowing the page, and it's making it look really crappy on smaller devices. So that's why the best practice at most companies is to not hard code values. So instead of setting the width to a pixel value like this, here's what we'd do. We'd get rid of this and would say width equal 100%. So that's 100% of the parent element. And you can see that that's immediately more responsive. You see how the width is adapting to the width of the page? But what if we didn't want our element to be this big? What if we still wanted it to be 400 pixels wide? Well, what we'd do is we'd set a max width. So we'd type in max dash width colon, and here we're going to say 400 pixels. And you can see now that our element has a width of 400 pixels, just like we want. But take a look at what happens when we get to smaller screens. So currently, our element is 400 pixels wide, but as soon as we get into smaller screens, look what happens. Our element's width starts to adapt. So it's no longer overflowing the page. It's completely responsive. And how this works is our screen is about 700 pixels wide right now. And our element wants to be 100% of that width. It wants to be 700 pixels. But this max width says, sorry, the largest you can get is 400 pixels. But as soon as we head below 400 pixels, our width 100% kicks in and makes sure that our element is not stuck at 400 pixels. It takes up 100% of the available width, keeping our element nice and responsive. Now, another best practice we use at companies is to avoid setting this height property as much as possible. And let me show you why. Let's head back to our HTML, and within our box, let's create a paragraph element. And in here, I'm going to type in lorem 40, and that's going to give us 40 words of placeholder text. Now, if we head back to our CSS, and we give this element a hard-coded height of 200 pixels, you'll notice that everything fits in now, but when we head to smaller screen widths, our element is no longer responsive. Now, how do we fix this? Well, we avoid setting the height property, and you'll see our element is now responsive. So these are just a couple of best practices I wanted to teach you because no other courses out there are doing this. But do not worry, this is just the beginning. We've got a ton more best practices that we're going to be teaching you throughout the course, and we're going to be drilling these into you throughout the different projects that we build together. You really don't want to miss this stuff because these are things I learned working in the field, working within a company, and the truth is no other courses out there are teaching these best practices, but they're super important for you to succeed. So if you seriously want to land a job, you can't be missing the rest of these best practices. Anyways, let's head back to our code, and I want to tell you about one exception where we can set the height property. And that's when we set the height to 100 VH. So VH stands for viewport height, which basically means screen height. So when we set the height to 100 VH, we're basically saying we want this element to be 100% of the screen's height. And when we set it to something like 70 VH, well, that means that we want the element to be 70% of the screen's height. But what case would require us to use something like this? Well, we usually use VH for landing pages. And we set the height to 100 VH. For example, this is a project you're going to be building later on in the course, and you can see this landing page is 100% of the screen's height. So if we hit inspect element on this section, you'll be able to see that we've actually set the height to 100 VH. So as soon as we scroll down, even just one bit, that's when we see the next section of the website. So that's really the main use case of a VH. And if you aren't understanding things right now, don't worry, you're going to be using these a ton more times throughout the course. So you're going to get really comfortable with them. But for now, all you need to remember about width and height is that you can set them as a percentage, as a pixel value, or as VH or VW. So VW is the same as VH, but it refers to screen width instead of screen height. So since we've set our max width to 100 VW, that means our element is going to take up 100% of the screen width. But if we set it to 70, you guessed it, only 70% of the screen width. So now that we've got that out the way, you've taken your notes on this, we can move on to our next properties, which are going to be these fonts. So there's only really 3 font properties that we need to know about. We've got font family, and that's used to set the font family of the text. So that's like Arial, Sans Serif, Times New Roman. Font size, which is used to set the size of the text. So that's how big or small our text is. And then we have font weight, which is used to set the weight of our text. So that's whether our text is bold or light or medium. So now let's jump into a live code example to show you how we actually use these. So we're back in our code now, and what I'm going to do is just separate all of these properties so that everything is easier to understand. So color, background color, and then width and height, all of our width and height properties. And if you're wondering how I created these comments, just hit Control and slash and you get a comment just like this. And the first font property we're going to be covering is font size. And this is pretty self-explanatory. If we set a larger number, like 40 pixels to be our font size, you see our text is going to become very large. But if we set a small number, like 8 pixels, our text is going to become very small. Our next property, font weight, is going to make our text bold or light. So if I write in 600, and let's quickly increase the font size so that we can see our text properly, you'll see that our text is now bold. But if I change this back to 400, you'll see that the text is now normal. And we can also set it to be bold in plain English. So we can say bold. That's going to set the text to bold. And if we head to the styles, select this element, we can actually play around with the font weights here. So you can see we have a bunch of different font weights available to us. And you're going to see that a lot of these font weights don't seem to do anything. So when we get to 600, yeah, we change, but 700, 800, 900, 300, 200, we don't really see any changes. And that's because we've not actually imported these font weights. And we're going to cover how to do that when we talk about the font family property. So once we get through that, you'll fully understand what I mean when I say import. So let's cover the font family property. And what this does for us, like I mentioned earlier, is allow us to choose the family of our font. And you can see by default, CSS already provides us with a bunch of fonts that we can use. So if we type in Arial, that's one of the fonts that we can use. We can type in Times New Roman, and that's the one we were using earlier. We can use Helvetica. There's so many different fonts that CSS provides for us. And you can see that for some reason, we can actually use commas when we're setting the font family of our text. But what does this mean? Well, these are what we call fallback fonts. And what's actually happening here is that we're going to try and use the Arial font But if the browser we're currently on doesn't support this font, well, then we're going to fall back and use this font instead. So think of it as a failsafe. We basically are saying if the browser doesn't support this font, well, then use this font instead as a backup. But how do we get fonts like we have on ASAP Frontend? You can see that these aren't your typical CSS fonts that we get by default. Well, we do this by importing fonts, and I'm going to show you how to do this right now. So how I typically do this is I search for Google Fonts. I click on this first website here, fonts.google.com, and here, Google is actually going to give us a bunch of fonts that we can import and use on our website. And on this search bar at the top here, we can actually search for specific fonts that we want. So in this case, the font that we use on ASAP Frontend is called Inter. So I'm going to search for that. Click on this option here. And you can see that within this font family, that we can select a bunch of font weights that we want to use. So this is what I was talking about earlier, about importing the different font weights within a font. So what font weights do we want to use? Well, let's say we want to use light 300, regular 400, bold 700, and that'll do for now. So if we open up this sidebar by clicking on this little icon here, we'll be able to see the font family that we've selected, as well as all of the different font weights that we've chosen to use. So in order to import this and actually start using it in our website, we're going to click on this import option here. We're going to copy everything between these two style tags. So copy that. And let's put this to the side now. And within our CSS file at the very top, we're going to paste this in. So what this is going to do is import the Inter font with all of the different font weights that we want to use. So if we close this out and head back to our website, you'll see that we're still using the Arial font for some reason. We've imported the Inter font. Why is it not working? Well, that's because we actually have to specify that we want to use it. So let's get rid of this. And let's say we want our font family to be Inter. And you can see that our font family has actually changed. And just to confirm, let's hover over this and you can see that the font is 16 pixels Inter. And you'll also see that since we've imported font weights 300, 400, and 700, if we go ahead and use these values, we can actually see a difference. But not every single browser is going to be able to support this Inter font. So what do we need to do? What's the best practice that we use at companies? We're going to add a fallback font. So if the Inter font family is not accepted by the browser, then we're going to use the sans serif font family as a backup. And the reason we're specifically using the sans serif font as our backup is because it's what we call a web-safe font. And that basically just means it's a font that's accepted by almost every single browser, so we can confidently use it as our backup. So just to recap, font size allows us to make our text big or small. We use font weight to set the weight of our text. So if we want it light, then we use something like 300. If we want it medium, so just normal, we use something like 400. And if we want it bold, we use something like 700. And lastly, font family allows us to set the family of our text. Now we get a bunch of default options with CSS. But if we aren't happy with those and we want some different kinds of fonts, what do? We go to fonts.google.com, pick any one of these, choose the weights, so select the font weights that you want to use. Go ahead, head to the import option and copy everything between the two style tags and paste that straight into your CSS file. But we're going to keep the Inter font for now, so we can close this out. And that's about it for the font properties. Now our last CSS property is border, and it's fairly simple. All it does is set a border around the element. So let's head back to our code now and walk through a couple border properties. So the first one I'm going to write down is border width. Now what that does is set us a border width on this element. Now I'm going to say 4 pixels. So this is going to be a border of 4 pixels all around this element. But even though we've set the border width, for some reason we still don't see the border. And that's because borders are made up of multiple parts, and we need at least 2 of those parts for it to function properly and show on the page. So I need to set a border style to set the style of the border, and I'm going to say solid for now. And you'll see that we actually get a border that's 4 pixels wide showing on our page now. Now we've got one last border property, and that's the border color. And that allows us to set the color of our border. So if I say border color green, the border color is now going to be green. And if I change it to say blue or pink, that should be easier to see. That's going to set the border color to pink. So now we've got our border, but it took us 3 whole properties to do it, which is really annoying. But lucky for us, what CSS actually has is a shorter way to do all of this in one line of code. So let's remove all of this. And if we just use the border property, we can type in, and I want you to code along with me, 4 pixels, solid, pink, and we get the exact same border, and we only had to use one property. So this first value here is used to set how wide the border is. So if we say 10 pixels, the border is going to be 10 pixels wide. 20 pixels, it's going to be 20 pixels wide. This second value is used to set the style of the border. So if you really wanted to, you could change it to something like dashed or dotted. But 99% of the time, you're going to be using the solid style. And this third value here is used to set the color of the border. So if we change this to black or green or purple, you'll be able to see the difference. So this shorthand here that CSS gives us is what we're going to be using 99% of the time for our borders. So that's all of our most common CSS properties complete. Let's do a quick recap of everything we've just learned. So background color is used to set the background color of our element, and then color is used to set the color of the text. So background color is making this all red, and if we set the color to, let's say, aqua, you'll see, bang, our text is now this color. And then we have width and height, which are used to set the width and height of our elements. And they take in percentages, pixels, viewport height, and viewport width. And of course, it's not best practice to hard code our width and our height. So if we want our element to be a certain width, we add on a max width and we hard code it there, so that when our screens get below a certain width, they're still responsive. And as for the height property, we want to avoid setting it as much as possible, because if we hard code the height, let's say 800 pixels, and we reduce the screen width, you'll see that when we get into smaller screens, we run into issues with responsiveness. But if we go ahead and remove the height, you'll see that we no longer run into those issues, which makes it much easier to make our element responsive. And after that, we have font family, font size, and font weight. So font family is used to set the family of our text. Font size just determines how big or small our text is, and then font weight is used to determine the boldness or lightness of our text. And last but not least is the border property, and we use that to set a border around the elements. And we do that by using the shorthand that CSS gives to us, where we specify the width of the border, the style that we want, and then the color that we want our border to have. Now, I know that was a lot to take in, and you might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed right now. But like I always say, throughout the rest of the course, we're going to be drilling these fundamentals into you so much that you'll be able to write these out with your eyes closed. So don't focus on memorizing every single little property, just focus on kinda understanding what we use these for. If you can do just that, you're on the right track. So now that we've covered the most common CSS properties, what we're going to do is move on to specificity. So that's going to be selectors, classes, and IDs. So what we're going to do now is start with a fresh slate. We're going to get rid of all of this stuff here. And within our code, what we're going to do is create two paragraphs. So 1 and 2. Now you may be thinking, what in the world is a selector? But you kinda already know what they are. If you wanted to, say, add some styles to these paragraphs, what you do is you type in P, and then in here, you'd write in all of the styles. So this P right here is the selector. We use a selector to select what elements we want to add styles to. But what if we only wanted to add styles to one individual P tag? Well, this is not going to work because if we did this, this is going to target every single P tag on the page. And I can demonstrate this by writing in, let's say, color red. And you can see now that every single paragraph on the page is going to be red. So again, what if we wanted to style just this one P element right here? How would we do that? Well, we can use something called class names, and they provide us with a way to single out certain elements and say that we only want to add styles to them. So in order to use a class, all we have to do is go to the element we want to single out and just type in class equal, and then we can write in whatever class name we want. So I'm going to say paragraph 1. And once we have our class name, we can go over to our CSS file. And now instead of saying just P, which is going to target all of the paragraphs on the page, we can remove this and then say dot and then the class name, which is paragraph 1. So if we're targeting a class as our selector, it always has to start with a dot. And then after the dot or full stop or whatever you want to call it, we put the actual class name, which in our case is paragraph 1. And now what CSS is going to do is say, okay, anything with a class of paragraph 1 is going to have a color of red. And since on our page, this is the only paragraph with a class of paragraph 1, then this is going to be the only paragraph that gets these styles. And you can see that's exactly what we get on our page. Only this one paragraph with a class of paragraph 1 gets these styles and has a color of red. And that's kind of why we use classes, just to select and single out certain elements that we want to add styles to. Now, these classes aren't limited to just one element. We could add this same class to another element on the page and they would also get these styles. So let me demonstrate this by adding another paragraph on the page. So let's add 2 more. And let's say this third one here is also going to have a class that's equal to paragraph 1. And what's going to happen now is over here, we're looking for any element with a class name of paragraph 1. And we have 2 of those elements now. So if we zoom out, you can see that we have 2 elements that have a class of paragraph 1. We've got this one and this one. So this selector is now going to select both of these elements and style both of them. So that's why on our page now, you can see that both of these paragraphs now have a color of red. And another added benefit of class names is that, let's say we're working with another developer, we're working in a team, and he comes into our code base and he creates a new paragraph. And let's say he wants to turn this pink. He goes below our styles and he says P. He wants to target all paragraph elements and change the color to pink. You'll see that all of the other paragraphs on the page are going to turn pink except the paragraph elements with a class name of paragraph 1. And the reason for that is that even though this P selector comes after this class. Since using a class name to target elements is more specific than using a generic element selector, these styles are gonna get prioritized. And that's what CSS specificity is. Specificity just refers to the prioritization of certain styles over others. So the more specifically you target your elements, the more those styles will get prioritized over others. And the same goes vice versa. The less specific you are on how you select your elements, the less priority they will get. Now, the least specific way we can target our elements, which means the least prioritization, is generics. So that means generic element selectors like div or p or h1, those will have the least specificity and hence the least priority. Now, classes are a step up from generics. They are more specific, so they will get more prioritization of their styles. And now finally, IDs are the most specific and they will get the most priority. And you're probably thinking right now, what the hell are IDs? Don't worry, I'm about to show you what they are right now. IDs are actually very, very similar to classes. And in order to use an ID, it's fairly simple. Just like we did with a class, we say ID equal, and then we type in the name of the ID that we want our element to have. So in this case, I'm just going to say first paragraph. Now the catch with IDs, the thing that makes them different from classes is that you can only use this ID once throughout your entire page. So I mentioned earlier that you can put the same class on multiple elements. This is not the case with IDs. This is very bad practice. So if I take this ID, I copy it, and I also try to put it on this paragraph here, we cannot do that. We can change this to something else, maybe third paragraph, but we cannot use the same ID across multiple different elements. And the fact that you can't have the same ID across multiple different elements is what makes them more specific and hence have their styles be prioritized more. So let's head back to our CSS and head on top of all of these styles here. And in order to target an element based off its ID, we used a full stop for class names. Now we use a hashtag. So we type in hashtag and then the name of the ID we want to target. So in this case, it's going to be first paragraph. So we're targeting the element that has an ID of first paragraph. And let's say we want it to have a color of black. Bang. You can see that even though this class and this generic element selector come after this ID, its styles are still getting prioritized because it is the most specific. It has more specificity. But if we have the same specificity, let's say we target the ID again and we change its color to, let's say, green this time. Since these have the same specificity now, they're both as specific as each other, while the one that comes after is going to be prioritized. And if you're wondering, yes, in our CSS, we can target the same ID multiple times. Now, would you believe me if I told you there was a way we could be even more specific? Now, this method I'm about to show you is not best practice at all. You don't want to be using this in your code, but the unfortunate truth is a lot of developers out there don't know these best practices. They're writing bad code because you're not going to learn these best practices anywhere unless you're learning with ASAP Frontend or you're working in a company. Now, let's say we wanted to target this paragraph here that has a class of paragraph 1, but we didn't want to use its ID, right? What we could do to be more specific than these styles right here is before we specify the class we're looking for, we could also specify the element. So p.paragraph1. And what this is doing is instead of saying we're looking for any element with a class name of paragraph 1, which is what this is doing, we're saying we're only looking for p elements with a class name of paragraph 1. And that's going to be more specific than the styles within here because we're specifying we're only looking for P elements. So now if we set the color to say green, this is going to have higher priority over this, even though it comes after, because this is more specific. But these styles aren't going to affect this element right here. Even though it is a paragraph element with a class of paragraph 1, it's not going to get these styles here. It's not going to have a color of green. And that's because it has an ID of first paragraph, and we're styling that in our CSS. And in the eyes of CSS, a single ID has more specificity than a generic and a class name put together. So what's another way we can be more specific than an ID? Well, CSS actually allows us to target elements based on multiple class names. So in order to give this a shot, we have to first give an element multiple class names. And doing this is pretty simple. All we have to do is go to the class here and add a space between the first class name and then add our second class name. And there we have it. We have two different class names that we can use to target this element. So we've got paragraph 1 and also red. So let's head back to our CSS. And if we target this first class name and also add on this second class name, that's going to be more specific than everything below here. So if we give this a shot and set the color to red, hopefully this first paragraph will be changed to red because we're using two class names to target it. We're saying only elements with a class name of paragraph 1 and a class name of red will get these styles. And that's pretty specific, right? But using multiple class names as our selectors is still not more specific than a single ID in the eyes of CSS. So what's going to happen, even though these styles are coming after, these styles are going to take priority and our first paragraph is still going to have a color of black. But if you want to be extremely specific, we can take this even further. We can say the element with an ID of paragraph 1 that also has a class of paragraph 1 as well as a class of red. Let's change the color to red. And you'll see that the color of the first paragraph is now going to change. Because now instead of a single ID, we're using an ID and multiple class names as our selectors. So CSS is going to view these styles as higher priority than everything else on the page, and hence apply these styles over everything else. So you can see this is a pretty deep rabbit hole we can go down, but we're not going to go there because using multiple selectors to be more specific is very, very bad practice. This is all you need to worry about. We target elements in our CSS using IDs, class names, and generic selectors. IDs are most specific, so their styles will get the most priority even though these come after. And IDs are second most specific, so their styles will get priority over generics, but they won't get priority over IDs. And finally, generic selectors, least specific of them all, will not get priority over class names or IDs. But there's one more thing we can do to be extremely specific and make your styles take over everything on the page. And that's adding exclamation mark important to the end of a style. And you can see immediately CSS doesn't care anymore that this is a generic and these are class names and IDs and are meant to get priority. No, CSS absolutely prioritizes these styles. But you really, really, really want to avoid using this as much as you can, because down the line, it's going to make your CSS very, very hard to work with. So it's good to know it's here, but try and use it as little as you can. So that's really all we need to talk about when it comes to specificity. It's just the prioritization of styles. Generics get the least prioritization because they have the least specificity. Classes are a step above that. They get more priority than generics because they're more specific. And then IDs are going to get the most priority because they have the most specificity. How do we use these? For the generic selectors, we just reference the element. For the class name, it's the same thing, but we just add a class to the element that we want to work with, and then we use a dot before adding the class name in our CSS. And then for IDs, we add an ID to our element, and then we use a hashtag, and then the ID name to reference it in our CSS. And now we have specificity bad practices that you don't want to be doing, because these are going to overcomplicate your code and just make CSS hard for you. But when you join a company and start working in a team, you will be working with developers who haven't learned the best practices, so it's important to know that these exist. So get this down in your notes. This is how we can be more specific. But again, these are bad practices we don't want to be doing very often. So with that wraps up specificity, and I know that was a lot of theory to take in, but the point of this crash course is not for you to remember every little detail, right? It's just for you to gain a little bit of an understanding of how everything works, take the notes, and as we build the rest of our projects, that's where everything starts to come together. So if you're feeling dumb right now, just keep pushing. This will all make sense to you in the future. With that being said, it's time to move on to our next topic, which is going to be the box model. Now, what exactly is the box model? Well, the box model divides the elements on our page into 4 different layers. So every single element on our page, the divs, the paragraphs, the H1s, they're all made up of 4 different layers. So these orders are actually pretty important, are content, padding, border, and margin. So again, each and every single element on our page is made up out of content, padding, border, and margin. Let's visualize this with a diagram. So under the hood, this is what each and every single element on our page looks like. In the very center, we have our content, and that's going to be any content that we put inside of our element. For example, some text within a P element. And on the outside of the content, we have our padding. And outside of that, we're going to have our border if we do have one. So we learned about borders earlier. If we do choose to use a border, then that's going to be outside of the padding. And finally, outside of this border, we're going to have our margin. And these are the 4 layers that make up every single element on our page. So let's jump straight into our code and teach you about all this stuff with a live code example. So what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of all this CSS here and all of the HTML here. And we're going to give this div a class of box. And within it, we're just going to put a bit of placeholder text. So we're going to say lorem 15. And let's target this element with a class name of box. Let's give it a width of 200 pixels. And we're going to give it a border of 1 pixel, solid styling, and then a red color. And if we go ahead and hit inspect element now, and we head to the computer tab, you're going to see something very familiar. We're going to see the box model. And it looks exactly the same as what we covered over here. So content, padding, border, margin. This is exactly what we covered. And if we go ahead and create some more elements, so 1, 2, 3, you'll see that if we select them, head to the computer tab, they're all made up of the box model, no matter what element we select. So now let's actually remove the rest of these elements for now. And let's select this first one here, so we can get to the bottom of what's going on in here. So right now, our content has a width of 200 pixels, which we've set over here. And it also has a height of 72 pixels. We also have no padding, which is why we see a dash. But let me show you how we can add padding to this element. So in our CSS, all we have to do is write padding, and then we can say padding top to add padding on the top, padding left to add padding on the left, padding right to add padding on the right, and then padding bottom to add padding on the bottom. So in this case, let's say we want to add padding to the top of our element. So we're going to say padding top, and let's add a padding top of 20 pixels. And we can change this to any value we want. We can say padding top 20. We can say padding top 24 pixels. And this makes it so much easier to visualize the box model actually happening. We have our content, and then our padding, and then our border. And let's also add a margin. So this works the same way as the padding. We can say margin top, margin left, margin bottom, or margin right. But in this case, we're going to add a margin top of 24 pixels. And you can see if we hover over the box now, this is literally exactly what we covered over here. So let's play around with this some more. Let's go padding left, 20 pixels. And let's go margin left, 30 pixels. And let's increase the thickness of our border from 1 pixel to 8 pixels. And if we hover over this element now, we can really start to see the box model coming into play. So now we know that every single element on our page is made up of these 4 different layers. So margin, border, padding, content, and they make up what we call the box model. And they basically just help us organize the elements on our page easier. And we can change the values of these different layers in our CSS to achieve the look we want. So we can say padding top, padding left, padding bottom, (20 pixels), padding right, 20 pixels. And just like the border property, CSS actually gives us a shorthand that we can use to turn these 4 properties into one. So instead of writing out 4 properties to target the different sides of our padding, we can actually just turn this into one property called padding. And the way padding works in CSS is like a clock. The first value is going to give it a padding top of 16 pixels. The second value is going to give it a padding right of 16 pixels. This third value is going to give it a padding bottom of 16 pixels. And this last value is going to give it a padding left of 16 pixels. So again, just to be ultra clear, this padding property works like a clock: top, right, bottom, left. And margin also has the same kind of shorthand. So instead of going margin top, margin left, margin bottom, we can remove all this stuff and just use the single margin property. And this works the same as the padding. So it works like a clock. So this first value is going to give it a margin top of 16. This second value is going to give it a margin right of 16 pixels. This third value is going to give it a margin bottom of 16 pixels. And this last value is going to give it a margin left of 16 pixels. Now, what CSS does to make our life even easier is that if all of the values are the same, we don't have to type out 4 individual values. We can just change this to one singular value. And what this is going to do is give our element a padding of 16 pixels on all sides, as you can see. And we can actually do the same thing for margin. Remove all of these extra values, and you'll see that this is going to give our element a margin of 16 pixels on every single side. And another one of these tricks that you're going to be using quite often throughout the course is the 2 values. So this first value is going to allow us to set the top and bottom values of our padding, and this second value is going to allow us to set the left and right values of our padding. So if we say 8 pixels and then 16 pixels as the second value, you're going to see our element has a padding of 8 pixels on the top and bottom, and then 16 pixels on the left and right. And of course, we can use the same trick with the margin property. So if I chuck this in, you'll see that our element now has a margin of 8 pixels on the top and bottom, and then 16 pixels on the left and right. Now there's one more box model property that you should probably know about, and it's called box sizing. Now every single element on the page by default has a box sizing of content box. And this is super annoying because if we have a width and a height on our elements, what that means is only our content has a width of 200 pixels and a height of 150 pixels. And the padding and border aren't accounted into the width of the element. And that's super annoying because when we set an element to 200 pixels in width, we'd expect that our element would be 200 pixels wide. But no, our element is more like 240 or 250 pixels in width if we take into account the padding and the border. And I don't like that. If I give my element a width of 200 pixels, I want it to have a width of 200 pixels well and truly. Not do some weird calculations just to figure out the true width of my element. So what I do instead of using box sizing content box is I use box sizing border box. And you're going to see that our element is suddenly going to get smaller. So if I change this back to content box, you'll see that it was a little bit bigger before we changed the box sizing to border box. Well, that's because with box sizing border box, when we say a width of 200 pixels, we say that we want the true width of our element to be 200 pixels. So that's content plus padding plus border equal 200 pixels, which is exactly what I like. So just to be clear, when we say box sizing border box, we're saying that we want the width to be equal to content plus padding plus border. So we want the border and the padding to be accounted into the total width. But when we use box sizing content box, we say that we only care about the content being the width that we specify. And then the padding and the border are going to be on top of that. So these two are not going to be accounted into the width. And this is actually the default, but the best practice is to always set box sizing to border box. This way you don't have to do any weird calculations to get the true width of your element. CSS already does that for you in the background. So that's why in every single project we build together, for example, this ePortfolio website you're going to be using to apply to jobs, we set the box sizing to border box. So this asterisk is what we call a universal selector, which means it selects every single element on the page. And at the top of every single project that we build, at the top of that CSS file, we're going to set box sizing to border box. So if we go ahead and remove this style, you'll see that everything starts to look like crap. So that's why we keep box sizing as border box and everything looks much better. And that's pretty much it with the box model. Every element is made up of these 4 different layers, so content, padding, border, and margin, and those make up the box model. And by default, they have a box sizing of content box, which does not take into account the padding and the border into the width and height of the element. So what do? We use box sizing border box, so we have an easier time styling our elements. And you might be thinking right now, padding and margin both add spacing. So when the hell do I know when to use which one? Well, this is actually fairly simple. We use padding when we want to add space between the content inside of the element and the border of the element. And we use margin when we want to take this whole element and space it out from other elements on the page. And I think this is better explained with a demonstration. So let's jump into some code and test this out. So let's jump into our code and we're going to remove the padding and the margin for now. And what we're going to do is we're going to add some more elements on the page. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then from there, let's remove this hard-coded height and reduce the thickness of this border just a little bit. So I mentioned earlier that we use padding to add spacing between the actual content of the element, so that's in this case this text, and the border. So what you'll notice is if we add a padding of say 8 pixels on all sides, you'll see that the spacing between the content inside of the element and the actual border is going to increase. And if we change this to something like 24, it'll become way more apparent. So padding adds spacing between the content of the element and the border, kinda just giving the content room to breathe so it doesn't look cramped up against the border, like so. But you'll see that padding's not going to actually add any spacing between the different elements on our page. You can see our different elements are still touching each other. And that's what margin is for. So let's add a margin of 16 pixels. And you'll notice that that's going to add some spacing on the outside of the element and push it away from the other elements on the page. So just to summarize, padding is giving spacing on the inside of the element so that the content doesn't look cramped against the border, And margin is actually going to add some spacing on the outside to push that element away from other elements on the page. And you are going to get loads of practice with this later on in the course, and this stuff will become second nature to you. You'll know when to use padding and you'll know when to use margin. And with that, I want to say a huge congratulations to you, because that's everything you need to know about the box model complete. Yes, I know that was a lot of theory in such a short amount of time. So don't focus on memorizing everything, just focus on kind of understanding how everything works. So now that we're done talking about the box model, it's time for us to cover a few more CSS properties that are going to be a little more advanced. The first of which being this display property right here. So let's jump straight into it. So the CSS display property has two values, block and inline. And these two might seem familiar to you because in the HTML crash course, we actually briefly talked about block level and inline level elements. Block elements start on a new line and take up 100% of the available width. And some elements that have a display block by default are the P element, H1 all the way to H6 elements, and the div element. Now, inline elements are the opposite. They do not start on a new line and only take up the necessary width. And what you also need to know is that when an element has a display of inline, we cannot set the width and height of that element. And some examples of elements that have a display inline by default are anchor elements, span elements, and buttons. Now let's jump back into our code to see how these actually work. Okay, so let's start off by getting rid of all of this CSS and all of this current HTML. And then we're going to add a H2. And in here, let's just say CSS Crash Course. And let's create a couple of these. So 1, 2, 3. And we know that all H2 elements have a display block by default. So what are the traits we're going to see? Well, we can see that all of the elements are starting on their own new line. And if we head into inspect element, you'll see that all of these elements are taking up 100% of the available width within the parent. So now that we know what block elements look like, let's take a look at what inline elements look like. And we know that spans are display inline by default, so let's give them a shot. Let's add some of them on our page. So let's go below these H2s, and I'm going to create a span. In here, I'm going to say CSS. I am going to create another. And in here, I'm going to say Crash Course. And second, they're only taking up the necessary width to hold their content. So unlike these block elements, which are taking up 100% of the available width, these inline elements are only taking up the width that they need. And you'll also notice if we try and change the width of any of these inline elements, we're actually going to get a warning from CSS that says display inline property prevents width from having an effect. So if we have a display inline element, we cannot change the width. But if we go ahead and try and change the width of any of these block level elements, so let's say width 50 pixels, you're going to see that we can do that with no issues at all. And the same goes with the height property. If we go down to our span and we try and set the height, we're also going to get a warning from CSS again that says display inline property prevents height from having an effect. But if we try and change the height in our display block element, we can do it with no issues at all. And that's really it when it comes to the difference between block and inline elements. There are going to be some more advanced display values that we'll be covering later on in the course, but right now you don't need to worry about that. These two are really all you need to know. So now that we're done with the display property, let's move on to the position property. And this one is going to be a little bit trickier. But lucky for you, you're part of the ASAP frontend family, so you're going to be getting the best possible explanations. So what we have here is a couple of the most common CSS position values that you need to understand. and the first of which is position static. Now, all of the HTML elements we put on our page have a default value of position static. And static elements are nothing special, they just follow the normal flow of the page. Now, the next value we have is relative. And if we give an element a position of relative, it's kind of like a static element. It follows the regular flow of the page. But the difference is position relative allows us to change the position of our element and kind of shift it around by using top, right, bottom, and left. And I know you're probably confused as hell right now. Google Slides is not the best way to teach CSS. So let's jump into our code and I can show you what I mean by this. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is close our DevTools and let's get rid of these spans for now. And on the second H2, let's add a class of title. And then in our CSS, we're going to target this. And we're going to give it a background color of red. And now we're going to change the position to relative. So by default, this element would have had a position of static. So if we change this to static, you're going to see nothing is changing. And that's because, again, our element already by default had a position of static. And if we change this back to relative, it also appears that nothing is changing, right? But now if I come in and say top 100 pixels, that's actually going to influence where it is on the page. So if I change this to top 40 pixels and left 30 pixels, we're going to be moving it 40 pixels from the top. So that means 40 pixels down. And then 30 pixels from the left. So that means 30 pixels right from where the element was originally positioned in the regular flow of the page. So from where the element was when we didn't have any positioning on it, we move it 40 pixels down and 30 pixels to the right. And the important thing to remember with position relative is it's going to leave an empty gap where the element was originally positioned. So visually, we've gone ahead and moved it around, but the other elements are still treating it as if it was in this original position, which is why we see this gap. Now, when using position relative, we're hardly going to be using the top, left, right, and bottom. It's just something that we don't use very often. Instead, if we wanted to position our elements using top, left, right, and bottom, we would use position absolute. And position absolute can be a little bit difficult to wrap your head around, so let's walk through it together. So unlike static and relative elements, position absolute elements do not follow the normal flow of the page. So let's head back to our code and let's change this to position absolute. And let's take a look at what happens. And you're going to see a very big difference. So unlike position relative, which reserved the gap where the element was originally positioned and then we could move it however we want and still have that gap, as soon as we add position absolute, it's pulled out of the flow of the page and the rest of the elements sort of forget that it even exists. So that's what I mean when I say position absolute elements do not follow the normal flow of the page. And you'll also notice that when we use position absolute, our element is no longer taking up 100% of the available width like the rest of our headings. And that's something you should know. When we're using a display block element and we use position absolute on it, it no longer takes up 100% of the available width. It only takes up the necessary width to hold its content. So if we still want this element to take up 100% of the available width, we have to explicitly tell CSS that we want that. So width 100% because it's not going to do it automatically for us anymore. So just to recap, when we use position absolute, that element is no longer going to follow the normal flow of the page. The rest of the elements are going to forget it exists and the element is going to be in its own world. Now, the next thing we need to know about position absolute is that we can change the position of the element by using top, right, bottom, and left, just like a position relative element. So let's head back to our code. And if we position this bottom 0, you're going to see it's going to go all the way to the bottom of the page. If we do left 0, the element is going to go all the way to the left of the page. And the reason for that is when we set this bottom and this left within a position absolute, it's no longer relative to where the element originally was in the flow of the page. The position of the element is now relative. It's now based on the nearest position relative parent. Now let me show you what I mean by this. So let's head back to our HTML. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a div, and I'm going to give this a class name of parent. And within this, I'm going to put my h2. And then within this parent, I'm going to get rid of this h2. And I'm going to create a new div with a class of child. Now for the parent, I'm going to target it. I'm going to give it a height of 200 pixels. And it's going to have a background color of red. And then for the child, I'm going to give it a width of 24 pixels, a height of 24 pixels, and then a background color of green. I should probably make this a little larger, so let's go 64 pixels. Now what you'll notice is if I give this child a position of absolute, and let's say we set the bottom to 0. And what you'll notice is it's going to go to the bottom of the viewport. So since this absolute element has no position relative parents, it's going to automatically be positioned relative to the viewport, which means the screen. But what you'll notice is if we give this parent a position of relative, and this can be any other position. It could be position relative, position absolute, position fixed. As long as the position of the parent is no longer static, the child will now be positioned relative to the parent. But the reason why we use position relative over the other positions is because it allows us to make this child positioned relative to this parent without messing up the flow of the page. So now you'll see if we set the positioning of this element, so bottom 0, we could go bottom 50%, so we can actually use percentage values in here too. It's going to be moved 50% from the bottom. Left 50%, it's going to move it all the way down the middle. Top 0, it's going to move it to the top. Right 0, move it all the way to the right. So now you can see that when we have a position absolute element, it's going to be positioned relative to the nearest position relative parent. And if there's no position relative parents present, then it's automatically going to be positioned based on the viewport. So that's about it when it comes to position absolute. If you can understand these two things, you'll be fine. One is that when we use position absolute, the rest of the elements on the page forget it even exists. So if we give this element here a position of absolute, you can see that the rest of the elements forget that it even exists. They shift up. And 2 is that a position absolute element will be positioned based on the nearest relative parent. Don't worry if you still aren't understanding everything. Like I always say, the crash courses are just meant to give you a basic idea. The real learning happens when you build along with the project tutorials later on in the course. So make sure to write these down wherever you take your notes. And honestly, these 3 are the most common CSS position values that you're going to be dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Now we're going to be covering a couple more uncommon CSS position values that we won't be typically using day to day, but they're still important to know. The first of which is position fixed. Now, just like position absolute, position fixed does not follow the normal flow of the page. And also, like position absolute, position fixed elements can have their position changed by using top, right, bottom, and left. But now where the two values differ is that position fixed will always be based on the viewport, whereas position absolute will be based on the nearest position relative parent. And if a position relative parent or any other position besides static does not exist, only then will it be positioned relative to the viewport. So let me demonstrate this to you by turning this into a position fixed element. You're going to notice that even though it does have a position relative parent, because it is position fixed, it's going to be positioned relative to the viewport 100% of the time. So when we say right 0 and top 0, it takes us to the top right of the viewport. And another cool thing with position absolute is if we set the body to say 150 VH in height so that we can get a scroll, you'll notice that position fixed elements, since they're always positioned relative to the viewport, is they're going to stick wherever we position them. They're going to stay there, no matter how far up or down we scroll. So essentially, we use position fixed whenever we want to stick an element in a permanent location on the screen. For example, in our portfolio that we're going to be building later on in the course, you can see that we have our navbar sticking to the top of the screen, no matter how far up or down we scroll in our page. And we use position fixed for that whenever we want to stick an element permanently in one place on the screen and we never want it to move. Now we have one last position value, and that is position sticky. So position sticky elements will follow the normal flow of the page until the user scrolls past a certain point. And once the user scrolls past that point, it will then become a position fixed element. So let's try this out. Let's turn this element back to absolute. And then let's make this parent position sticky. And how a position sticky element actually works is once the user scrolls past the element, so once it starts to scroll past it, that's when it'll turn into a position fixed element. And in order to make this work, we have to say, all right, once we scroll past this element and it does turn into position fixed, where do we want it to be on our screen? For example, I'm just going to say once we scroll past the element and it turns into position fixed, I want it to be at the top of the screen. And you can see, as soon as we scroll past the element, bang, turns into position fixed and goes to the top of our screen. Now you're barely ever going to use this, but it's good to know that it's there. And just like that, I want to say a huge congratulations, because that wraps up our advanced CSS properties. Like I keep saying over and over, if you're feeling confused, that's 100% expected. You're not meant to be an expert after watching these crash courses. You're just meant to have a basic idea of what's going on and make a couple notes so that when we're building projects together, you're not going to be completely confused. And it's in those projects where you're going to be learning the most, where everything you learnt in this video is going to come together. So don't get discouraged, just keep pushing through, and I guarantee this will all make sense. Now we're going to be moving on to our next topic, which is media queries. But what are media queries? Well, media queries are a CSS feature that allows us to make our website look good on all screen sizes, no matter how big or how small. So let's jump back into our code. Let's delete our CSS and let's delete everything in our HTML. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a H1 that's going to have a class of title. And in here, we're going to say, welcome to my website. And then below that, we're going to have a paragraph, and that's going to have a class of paragraph. And in here, we're going to get 30 words of lorem placeholder text. And let's head to our styles now and add some styling to these elements. So we're going to get the title, and let's give it a font size of 52 pixels. And then the paragraph, let's give it a font size of 24 pixels. Now this looks all good to us, but let's say someone comes to the website on their phone. So let's click on this option here that we get in our dev tools. Click on this and we can actually use this to simulate what our website would look like if someone comes on any kind of device. So let's say someone comes to our website on an iPhone 14. So this is what our website would look like if someone came on an iPhone 14, and let's say we think this text is way too large. We don't want it wrapping onto a different line. How would we go about adding some styles so that on smaller screens we make this text smaller so it doesn't wrap on a different line, but still keep this text size because we like it on bigger devices? It looks good. Well, media queries make this very easy for us to do. So let's walk through how we can use them to help us achieve our goal. So in order to create a media query, what we have to do is type in @media. And then they have parentheses and then brackets. And it's within these brackets that we're going to write all of the styles that's going to change our title and make it look good on smaller devices. But before we do that, within these parentheses, we have to specify when we want the styles that we write within here to come into play. So in order to do that, we're going to say max width, and we want these styles to come into play when we're on mobile phones, right? So when we come into the website on a smartphone, we want these styles to come into play and make the website look good. Well, in order to do that, we have to use what is called a breakpoint. And since we want our website to look good on smartphones, we're going to use 480 pixels as our breakpoint. So we're going to say max width of 480 pixels. And what this is essentially saying is that the styles within here have a max width of 480 pixels, which basically means that the styles that we write within here are only going to be applied when the screen width is smaller than 480 pixels. So when we're on a smartphone like this with a screen width of 430 pixels, these styles will be applied. But as soon as we get bigger than that, now we're on 700 pixel screen width, these styles are going to get thrown out the door, forget they exist. So let's give these a shot and see if they work. Within our media query, we're going to target the title, and we're going to say once our screen width is smaller than 480 pixels. Well, let's change the title's font size to 32 pixels. And what you're going to see is when the screen is larger than 480 pixels, these styles are not going to be applied. But as soon as we get smaller, bang. As soon as we hit that 480 pixel breakpoint, bang. The font size of the title changes to whatever we defined within here. So now when we're on smartphones, when the screen width is below 480 pixels, our title is still on one line. But when we go onto bigger screens, we still have the large font size that we prefer. I want you to have a go at this now. Try making it so when we get below 480 pixels, as well as the title changing, let's change the font size of the paragraph. Let's make it smaller. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to go ahead and give that a shot, and we'll walk through the solution together. Hey, welcome back. Hopefully you managed to find the solution. If you didn't, all good. We're going to walk through it together right now. So like I mentioned earlier, what we want to do is once the screen width gets below 480 pixels, as well as changing the font size of the header, we also want to change the font size of the paragraph. So in order to do that, let's go within our media query here, and let's target our paragraph. And let's reduce the font size to say 20 pixels. And now what's going to happen? As soon as the screen size gets below 480 pixels, bang. These styles come into play to make our website look good on mobile devices. And we aren't limited to just one media query. We can have multiple. So let's say we think this jump is a little too large. Let's say we want to do something for the large smartphone devices as well. Well, all we have to do is make another media query and use this as our breakpoint. And all these breakpoints you're seeing here are what we use to make our website look good on all devices. If we want to create some style changes for tablets, we create a media query and we use 768 pixels as our breakpoint. If we want to create some style changes for laptops, we use a media query and use 1024 pixels as our breakpoint. So make sure to note these down somewhere. These are the most common CSS breakpoints and we're going to be using them very often throughout the course. So in this case, what do we want to do? We want to make our website look good on large smartphones. So we create a media query and the max width is going to be 640 pixels. So all of the styles within here are going to get applied once the screen is smaller than 640 pixels. So let's say title will be a bit larger than it is on the small smartphones. It's going to be 36 pixels. And then the paragraph is also going to be a bit larger. It's going to be 24 pixels. And you can see that we've got small jumps, small changes in font size as we increase and decrease our screen size. And this is how we use media queries. And this is exactly how we make ASAP frontend look good on all devices. When we hit inspect element, you'll see that as the screen size decreases, some styles start to come into play to again make the website look good on smaller devices. And the best practice I want to quickly teach you is to keep your highest media queries at the top. So since this is the highest breakpoint, we're going to keep it on top of 480 pixels, and this is not going to affect anything. If we remove this and bring this up, everything is still going to work just fine. But this is just going to make your code easier to read, easier to get an idea of what's going on when everything is just in the right order. So feel free to play around with this, add some more elements in the page, and play around with, changing their styles with media queries. And once you feel comfortable and, kind of understand how media queries work, we're good to move on to our final topics. The first of which is going to be pseudo selectors. So let's get rid of everything here. All of the CSS and all of our HTML. And if you head to ASAP Frontend and we go to the dashboard, you'll notice that when we hover over this button, it actually becomes a little bit transparent. And we'll see the same thing if we head to the sidebar. If we hover over the different videos in the course, you'll see that they also get this hover effect, and both of them have this sort of smooth transition. How do we do that? Well, that's where a pseudo class comes in handy. And in order to show you how to do this, we're going to create a button. And within here, I'm just going to type in continue learning, just like we can see on ASAP Frontend. And then from there, we're going to head to our CSS and let's zoom in a little bit. So 1, 2, 3. And let's figure out how we can make it so when we hover over this button, we get the same sort of smooth transition into transparency that we can see on ASAP Frontend. In order to do this, we have to target our button and use the hover pseudo class. So in order to do that, we get the button that we want to add the hover effect to, and then we say :hover. And again, that's going to give us access to the hover pseudo class. So now whatever styles that we write within here are going to be applied to this button only when it is hovered over. So for example, if I type in background color red within this hover pseudo class, now you're going to see that whenever I hover over the button, bang, these styles are going to be applied to this button, and we're going to get a background color of red. But as soon as we stop hovering over the button, CSS forgets these styles even exist, and the button loses its color. So now we know what this hover pseudo class is and how to use it. Let's go ahead and try and recreate the hover effect on this button that we see on ASAP frontend. So when we hover over our button, we want it to become sort of translucent, and when we stop hovering over it, we want it to go back to normal. So in order to do that, we're going to say when our button is hovered over, let's access the opacity property. And this property is pretty self-explanatory. All it does is allow us to set the opacity of our element, so how clear or transparent it is. So 100% would be not transparent at all, and 0% would be completely transparent. So we wouldn't be able to see our element, and we get all of these percentages that we can use in between. So when we hover over our button, let's give it an opacity of 30%. And you'll see as soon as we hover over our element, bang, it becomes semi-transparent. But as soon as we stop hovering over our element, CSS forgets these styles even exist, and our element goes back to normal. And we can actually test all this stuff out. If we head to our dev tools, hit this option here and select the button, and we click on this :hov, you'll see all of the different pseudo classes provided to us by CSS. Now, most of these pseudo classes aren't really important at all. You learn them on the fly by building out projects, so we're not going to be covering them in this video. But the only really important one that we're going to be using very often is the hover pseudo class, which is why we're covering it in this video. And what's super cool is if we check this checkbox, it's actually going to put the element in a hovered state permanently so that we can play around with the hover effect, see what it looks like, perfect everything, and then once we're finished, we can just take it out of the hovered state by unchecking the checkbox. But if we head back to ASAP frontend, you'll actually see that we have a sort of smooth transition on our hover effects. That just looks really good compared to what we have over here. So how do we go about adding that smooth transition to our button over here? Well, it's actually much easier than it looks. All we need to do is add the transition property that CSS gives to us. Now that we've accessed the transition property, all we need to do is define how long we want the transition to be. So in this case, a typical transition like the one we see on ASAP frontend is about 200 to 400 milliseconds. So we're just going to go 300 milliseconds, but we can go as high as we want. We can go 4,000, 5,000. But for now, we're just going to do 300 milliseconds. And if we hover over our button now, you'll see that we're getting that smooth transition in, but that transition out is not smooth at all. So if we pay close attention, we'll actually be able to see that. So the transition in, very smooth, but the transition out, that's where we have a problem. So in order to get that smooth transition out, we don't actually put this transition property within our hover pseudo class. Because remember, these styles are only applied when the button is hovered over. So when I hover over my button, these styles come into play and we get our transition, right? Since we're hovering over our button, we get our smooth transition. But as soon as I stop hovering over the button, these styles disappear, which also means this transition disappears, which is why the transition out is very abrupt. This transition property is not working anymore. So to fix this, all we need to do is just put the transition within the element itself instead of the pseudo class, so that this transition is applied all the time. And we can actually go really wild with these hover effects. We can go opacity, background color, padding. We can add all sorts of things when we're hovering over our element. And the cool thing about this transition property is you can actually specify which property you want to add a transition to. So if we only want to add a transition to, say, this opacity property, then we can write that down at the start, and you'll see that only the opacity property is going to get that smooth transition, but these other properties don't. If we wanted to just target the padding property and give it a transition of 300 milliseconds, we just write down padding, and bang. The padding is the only property to get that 300 millisecond transition. But typically, we want all of these properties to get that smooth transition. So what do? We leave it blank, and by default, that's going to make it so all of these properties get that smooth transition of 300 milliseconds. So that's really it for the basics of pseudo classes. You're going to be getting loads more practice with this stuff throughout the course when you're building projects. So I wouldn't be too worried if I wasn't understanding things right now. So now that we're done with pseudo classes, we're going to take a look at what pseudo elements are. I'm just going to write down my name. And let's zoom in on this. So let's zoom in, close up our dev tools. And the way we use pseudo elements is very similar to how we use pseudo classes. So what we'd do is we'd get the element. So that's our P element right here. And in order to use a pseudo element, we type in double colon. So instead of one colon like pseudo classes, to use pseudo elements, we type in double colon. And there's only two pseudo elements that we need to know about. The first one is before, and the second one is after. Let's start off by talking about this before pseudo element. So for every pseudo element that we use, we have to define some content. So this property right here is going to define the content of the pseudo element. We can leave the content as an empty string, which basically means that there's going to be no content within our pseudo element, and CSS will be fine with that. But what CSS will not be happy with is if we don't use the content property at all. That's when our pseudo element is not going to work properly. We have to define this content property. Now, if we open up the dev tools, you're going to see that we're actually going to be able to see our pseudo element. And currently, it has no content at all. So let's add some content within here. So let's say, hey, my name is, and if we close this out, you're going to see that our pseudo element is coming before our element. And that's because we've specified that we want to use the before pseudo element. So if we add a space, you can see how cool this is. We can see, hey, my name is Ayman. So we know now that a before pseudo element will put content before our actual element. But we can also do the same with the after pseudo element. And this is pretty self-explanatory. It's going to put the content after our actual element. And these pseudo elements are actually really powerful. We're not just limited to this content property. We can add all sorts of CSS properties to this. We can give this a background color of red, a margin of 8 pixels. And you can see that we can treat it like it's its own element. And just to show you how powerful pseudo elements can be in the real world, if we take a look at the portfolio we're going to be building later on in the course, these cool borders here that we see on our image, we actually do that using pseudo elements. So that should show you just how powerful these can be. So that's really all you need to know about pseudo elements for now, that we have to define the content. It can be an empty string for all we care. But CSS just does not like when we do not define the content property at all. So now that we're done with pseudo elements, we're going to be covering one of the last topics in this video, and that is going to be animations. So if we head back to our portfolio website, you're going to see that at the bottom of this page here, we have this really cool arrow, and it's kind of floating up and down with this cool animation and is prompting us to scroll further down the page. And we actually did this using CSS. So let me show you how to do this. So let's head back to our page and let's just zoom back in. And let's try and make this element float up and down just like this. So to create animations in CSS, all we need to do is type in @keyframes. And after that, we actually have to specify the name we want our animation to have. Now in this case, I'm just going to call it something like point down. And once you write down the name, we have to follow it with curly braces. Now, once we're inside of these curly braces, how we're going to set our animations is by defining a 0% and a 100%. So these are basically defining the different stages of our animation. So 0% would be the start and 100% would be the finish. And now what we actually have to do to create an animation is define where we want to be at the start of our animation and then where we want to be at the finish. So in our case, we just want to get this pointing down effect. So in order to do that, we'll have to use a CSS property that we've not covered yet. And that's called transform. Now, when we use this transform property, that's going to give us access to something called translate. So that's this thing right here. Now, what this translate value allows us to do is change the position of our element horizontally and vertically. So the first value that we type in is going to be the X, and the second value, the Y. So if we type something into this first value, that's going to move it horizontally. And if we type something in this second value, that's going to move it vertically. Now in our case, we don't really want to move the element on the X-axis. We only want to move it up and down. So that's the Y-axis. So what we can do, since we only want to move it on one axis, is translate Y. And that's going to allow us to, if we type something in here, it's only going to move it on the Y-axis. So up and down. So what we're going to do now is we're going to say at the start of our animation, we don't want to be moved down at all, right? Let's have our default position. And let's say at the finish of our animation, let's push ourselves down 16 pixels. And you're going to see now that even though we've created our animation, it doesn't seem to be working. Well, the reason for that is, yes, we've created our animation, but we actually have to specify that we want to use it on this element. So in order to do that, we have to go to this element and use the animation property. And this property is actually going to allow us to use an animation on this element. And then what we have to do is write down the name of the animation that we want to use. So in this case, it's this point down animation. And we also have to write down the duration. So how long do we want this animation to last? So in this case, let's go 1000 milliseconds or 1 second. And if we go ahead and reload our page now, get rid of this transform, you're going to see that our animation is actually running. So let's zoom in on this. Our animation is actually running. But you can see that once the animation finishes, it kind of just jumps back to its original spot and it doesn't run infinitely. So if we take a look at the portfolio, you can see that the animation runs infinitely. So the way we can make it run infinitely is pretty simple. We just add on the infinite to this animation property. And now what you're going to see is the animation is running infinitely, yes. But when the animation finishes, it's going to abruptly jump back to the starting position and run the animation again, instead of smoothly going back up to the starting point and then running the animation again like we want. So in order to fix that, all we need to do is add on this alternate reverse to our animation. And what that's going to do is make it so once the animation finishes running, once we get to 100%, it's not going to abruptly jump back to 0%, right? It's not going to abruptly go all the way back up to the starting point. It's going to smoothly go back up. And you can see our animation is looking absolutely beautiful now. And that's really it when it comes to animations. Don't worry too much about memorizing stuff. Just focus on getting a little bit of an understanding of how everything works. We create our animation by writing down at keyframes and then the name we want our animation to have. We type down 0% and 100%. So this is the start and finish. And then we define what we actually want to happen during the animation within these two. And now that we've actually created our animation, all we need to do to use it on any element is to use the animation property, write down the name of the animation we want to use, how long we want it to run, and over here we can define how long we want the animation to run. Right now we've set it to run infinitely, but we can set it to run 5 times, 4 times, 1 time, 2 times. And then this last one here, alternate reverse, is just making it so when our animation finishes running, and then we're running it multiple times, that it goes back from the finish to the start point very smoothly. So that's all you really need to know about pseudo classes, pseudo elements, and animations. Again, those are the more advanced CSS properties. And we don't really use this stuff too often, so I wouldn't be, too worried if you're not understanding it. The main thing you should be focused on is the most important stuff, which is the box model, the display property, the position property. And in the next video, we're going to be talking about CSS layout, which is very important. And that's where I want you to be really putting most of your focus into. So now that we're finished with animations, we're going to be covering our very last topic. And that's going to be BEM or BEM CSS. This is a best practice we use at companies, and it's going to make your experience with CSS way smoother. So let's jump straight into this and talk a little bit about what BEM actually is. Well, BEM is actually more simple than you think. It stands for Block Element Modifier, and it is a naming convention that we use when writing CSS classes to keep our code more organized. And how the naming method goes is block __ element -- modifier. Now I know that seems insanely confusing, but don't worry, we're going to walk through what each of these mean together. So the first letter in BEM stands for block, and what it refers to is a standalone component. And what a standalone component means is basically just an element that doesn't rely on any other element on the page. It's its own component. So in the example on the bottom right, we have a box. And we give it a class of box because it doesn't rely on any other element on the page. Now the E in BEM stands for element, and that refers to parts of the block. So if we take a look at the example on the bottom right, within the box we have a H2, paragraph, and a button, all within the box. Now these are all elements that are within the box block. So what do? Well, let's take a look at the naming method. It goes block __ element. So we're going to give the H2 a class of box _ title because it is a title within the box. We're going to give this paragraph a class of box _ paragraph because it is a paragraph within the box. And then we're going to give this button a class of box _ button because it is a button within the box. And lastly, the M in BEM stands for modifier, and it refers to the variation or modifications of blocks and elements. So let's say we had multiple of these boxes on the page, but we wanted this specific button within this specific box to be different from all of the other boxes on the page. Well, what we'd do is we'd add a modifier class like so. So we could add some styles to this that would make it different from all of the other buttons on the page, but it would still have all of the styles of this original box button class. And that's pretty much it when it comes to BEM. And you might be thinking right now, why go through all of the trouble of using the BEM naming method? Why not just write our CSS classes like the example on the left? Well, let's say you're working in a really large code base as a software engineer and you're writing class names like the example on the left. It's going to make it very hard for other members of your team to figure out what these class names are actually for. Because look how vague they are. It's very hard to figure out the actual purpose behind them. So for example, someone is going to see this class name in our CSS and they're going to think, all right, is it the title within the box? Is it the title within, say, a form? Is it the title within a certain section on the page? You don't know what this title is actually for. And I guarantee you there's going to be issues with people rewriting class names, reassigning styles, and that's when the code base starts to get really messy and we don't want to deal with that. So in a nutshell, BEM just basically makes our code more organized, readable, and easier to work with in a team. And this is a best practice used at loads of tech companies. So if people see you writing CSS like this, they're going to be super impressed. Now I know that all probably sounded like a bunch of nonsense to you, and that's because BEM is not really the kind of thing you learn through a PowerPoint. It's the kind of thing you learn through practice, and people typically learn this through senior engineer mentors when they get their first software engineering job. But lucky for you, in the projects that we build throughout the course, we're going to be teaching you how to use BEM CSS properly and a bunch of other best practices that you don't want to miss out on. Anyways, with that, I have some good news for you, and that's that we're officially finished with the CSS Crash Course here at ASAP Frontend. I know that was a lot to take in such a short amount of time, but like I always say, these crash courses aren't meant to make you an expert. They're meant to give you a basic idea of how everything works, and when we build projects together, that's when the real learning happens. That's when all the theory that you learn starts to come together. So don't worry if you feel confused, that's 100% normal. Just keep pushing through the course, one video at a time, and you will succeed.
All right, guys, that is all for the HTML and CSS full course. I really hope you enjoyed. If you want to see more content like this, let me know in the comments below and go check out the rest of the videos on my page. If you want a full guide on everything you need to learn to code and land your first job, watch the free training that's about to pop up on the screen now. And of course, if you want one-on-one coaching to land your first coding job in the next 3 to 6 months guaranteed, apply to join the coding bootcamp with the first link in the description. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.